becomes a struggle for survival, where the laws of civilized society dissolve into brutal hierarchies enforced by whips and cudgels, where your value as a human being is measured only by how much labor can be extracted from your broken body before it finally gives out. It is to exist in a nightmare where your captors view you with less regard than they show their own livestock, where torture and death lurk around every corner, and where hope itself becomes just another memory of a life that seems impossibly distant. The orcs are one of the most successful species in the entire galaxy, outnumbering perhaps every other intelligent starfaring race, even humanity itself. They are creatures engineered for war by the ancient Old Ones during the War in Heaven, designed to be the ultimate soldiers. Their biology is a fusion of animal and fungus, making them incredibly resilient and nearly impossible to eradicate from any world they infest. Their psychology is utterly alien, dominated by an insatiable need for violence and combat. They reproduce through spores released throughout their lives, and especially at death, meaning that any world touched by orc presence will be plagued by them for generations to come. But what makes the orcs truly terrifying is not just their combat prowess or their overwhelming numbers. It is the fact that they see the entire universe through the lens of violence. Every interaction, every relationship, every moment of their existence revolves around the concept of strength and domination. They live in a rigid hierarchy where the biggest and strongest orc rules absolutely, and this worldview extends to how they treat those who fall into their power. To an orc, you are not a person. You are not even really a slave in the traditional sense. You are a grot, their word for servant or lesser being, occupying the same social position as the small Gretchen who scurry around their settlements performing menial tasks. The tangible rewards orcs fight for in their endless wars are simple: loot and slaves. Anything not destroyed during battle is looted. Any opponent not slain in battle is made a slave. This is not a complex system of bondage with laws and regulations. This is raw, brutal domination enforced through casual violence and the ever-present threat of death. Labor camps are a common sight in orc territory, filled with the broken remnants of conquered populations forced to toil endlessly in service to the orc war machine. When possible, orcs will enslave the entire population of a world, transforming planets into vast prison camps where millions labor under the green-skinned Xenos' merciless oversight. The experience of being an orc slave varies depending on which orc clan captures you, which war boss claims ownership of your labor, and what role you are forced to fill in their society. Some slaves work in mines, extracting the raw materials that feed orc industry. Others toil in fields and farms, growing food to sustain the massive appetites of their masters. Still others are forced to work in the crude factories and workshops where orc technology is cobbled together, assembling weapons and ammunition for the next battle. And then there are those whose fate is darker still, kept in pens like livestock, bred for the sole purpose of providing food for their orc masters. What follows is an examination of what it truly means to be enslaved by orcs. This is not a story of heroic resistance or dramatic escape, though we will touch on those elements. This is an unflinching look at the daily reality of orc slavery, at the physical torment and psychological horror that defines every moment of existence under their brutal rule. It is a journey through one of the darkest corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where the words on Imperial recruitment posters about glorious service are revealed as comforting lies in the face of a truth far more terrible. For those who fall into orc captivity, there is no glory. There is no honor. There is only survival, measured in hours and days rather than weeks or months, and the gnawing knowledge that death, when it finally comes, will likely be a mercy. The capture. How humans become orc slaves. The moment your world falls to the orcs, your life as you knew it ends. The transition from free, imperial citizen to orc slave can happen with shocking speed, often in the span of a single day or even hours. Understanding how this process unfolds is crucial to grasping the full horror of what awaits those who survive the initial orc assault. Orc invasions follow a pattern, though the specifics vary depending on the size of the attacking force and the nature of the target world. When a Wei-Aiki arrives in a system, it announces itself with overwhelming violence. Orc attack craft pour from crude spacecraft and space hulks, their numbers so vast that they can darken the skies of entire continents. The initial assault is characterized by an orgy of destruction as the orcs indulge their primary instinct, the pure joy of combat. During these first hours and days of invasion, survival is largely a matter of chance. The orcs are not discriminating in their violence. They kill with gleeful abandon, cutting down anyone who stands before them simply because they enjoy the act of killing. Soldiers, civilians, the young, the old, none of these distinctions matter to the greenskins in the heat of battle. Their crude weapons, massive compared to human firearms, tear through flesh and bone with horrifying efficiency. Their physical strength allows them to literally rip humans apart with their bare hands when ammunition runs low or when the mood strikes them. But not everyone dies in the initial assault. As the battle progresses and organized resistance crumbles, the nature of orc behavior begins to shift. Once the immediate thrill of combat starts to wane, the orcs remember the other reward of war: slaves. Those who surrender, those who flee but are captured, those who hide but are discovered, all become potential additions to the orc workforce. The Second War for Armageddon provides a stark example of this process. When the orc warlord, Gazgkul Mag-Uruk Thraka's forces overwhelmed the defenses of Hive Infernus, the demoralized officer in charge shamefully surrendered the entire Hive city without a fight. Refugee columns formed, stretching for hundreds of kilometers across the desert wastelands of Armageddon. These desperate people, fleeing the green tide, were systematically herded by orc speed freak biker units who circled them like predators stalking wounded prey. The bikers did not simply kill the refugees. Instead, they drove them back toward Hive Infernus, back toward their new masters, where they would be put to work as slaves in the orc war machine. This herding process is typical of how orcs handle large numbers of potential slaves. They lack the organizational skills to conduct orderly prisoner processing, but they understand the basic concept of driving groups of humans toward designated areas. Speed freaks on bikes and buggies, orc boys on foot with crude weapons. Even trained squigs and other creatures may be used to corral fleeing populations. Those who try to break away from the group are often killed as examples, their deaths serving to keep the others compliant through sheer terror. The actual moment of capture is often arbitrary and chaotic. You might be grabbed by a massive orc hand as you try to flee through rubble-strewn streets. You might find yourself surrounded by Gretchen armed with scavenged weapons, their high-pitched voices shrieking orders as they force you to join other captives. You might simply be in the wrong place when an orc runtherd sweeps through an area, rounding up anyone still alive to fill out their slave gangs. Physical violence during capture is almost universal. Orcs communicate through brutality, and they establish dominance over their new slaves through immediate and overwhelming force. Beatings are common, both to subdue resistance and simply because the orcs find it amusing. Bones may be broken, teeth may be knocked out. The message is always clear: you are powerless, you are property, and your survival depends entirely on your captor's whims. The journey to the labor camps or slave pens can be as harrowing as the capture itself. Orc logistics are crude at best, and slaves are often force-marched for days or even weeks to reach their final destinations. Those who fall from exhaustion or injury are typically killed on the spot, their bodies left to rot where they fall. Food and water are provided irregularly, if at all. The orcs seem to operate on the assumption that weak slaves who cannot survive the march are not worth keeping anyway. During these marches, you begin to understand the true nature of your new reality. The orcs do not hide their cruelty or temper their behavior. You watch as they casually torture captives for entertainment, pulling people from the column to use as living targets for weapon testing or gladiatorial combat. You see them select prisoners at random to be eaten, sometimes cooking them over fires, sometimes simply tearing into them raw. The screams of the dying become a constant background noise, a soundtrack to your new existence. Some captures occur in different circumstances. Individual humans or small groups may be seized during orc raiding parties on worlds not yet fully conquered. These raids are common as orc forces spread out from their initial landing zones, sweeping through surrounding territories to gather resources and slaves. Being captured in a raid means you might be thrown into a crude vehicle or cage and transported immediately to orc-held territory, often with minimal explanation of what is happening or what will be done with you. The psychological impact of capture cannot be overstated. In the span of hours, your entire existence is shattered. Everything you knew, everyone you cared about, all the structures and systems that gave your life meaning are torn away. You are stripped of your identity as an individual and reduced to a resource to be exploited. The orcs do not learn your name. They do not care about your skills or your history. You are simply another soft-skinned human, valuable only for the labor that can be extracted from you before you die. Perhaps most terrifying is the arbitrary nature of who is captured and who is killed. There is no logic to it, no pattern you can discern and use to increase your chances of survival. The orc who kills your friend standing next to you might spare you for no reason you can understand. The same orc might kill you tomorrow for equally incomprehensible reasons. This randomness is psychologically devastating, stripping away any sense of control or agency you might cling to. For some, particularly those from worlds with strong imperial faith, capture by Xenos is seen as a fate worse than death. The thought of serving aliens, of being forced to aid the enemies of humanity, conflicts with everything the imperial creed teaches. Some choose to fight to the death rather than accept capture. Others attempt suicide when the opportunity presents itself. But most, driven by the fundamental human will to survive, accept their new status as slaves and hope desperately that rescue might someday come. That hope, as we shall see, is almost always in vain. Once you enter orc captivity, escape becomes nearly impossible, and rescue by Imperial forces is extremely unlikely. The Imperium does not negotiate for prisoners. It does not launch rescue missions for enslaved civilians. The resources required to save you would be considered better spent on other military operations. In the cold calculus of Imperial strategy, you are already dead, your loss already accounted for in casualty reports filed by officials who never knew your name. The slave hierarchy and your place in it. Understanding your position in orc society is essential to survival as a slave. The orcs operate under a brutally simple hierarchy based entirely on size and strength, and this same principle extends to how they view and treat their slaves. However, the reality is more nuanced than it might initially appear, with various categories of slaves experiencing different treatment and having different chances of survival. At the very bottom of orc society are the snotlings, infantile orcoid creatures with limited intelligence used primarily for fungus tending. Just above them are the Gretchen, also called grots or runts, who are smaller, weaker orcoid subspecies that serve as the primary slave labor force within orc settlements. Gretchen perform all the menial tasks that orcs consider beneath them, from food preparation to message delivery to general organization and maintenance work. Human slaves occupy the same social position as Gretchen. The orc word for servant or slave is grot, and this term is applied equally to Gretchen and to non-orcoid slaves like humans. This linguistic detail reveals an important truth. To the orcs, there is no meaningful distinction between a Gretchen slave and a human slave. Both are weak, soft creatures to be bullied, exploited, and discarded when no longer useful. However, even within this lowest tier of orc society, there exists an informal hierarchy based on perceived usefulness. Not all slaves are treated equally, and understanding these distinctions can mean the difference between a relatively tolerable existence and a short, brutal death. The most fortunate slaves, if such a term can be applied to any aspect of orc captivity, are those with valuable skills that orcs cannot easily replicate. Technical expertise is particularly prized. While orc mech boys possess an instinctive understanding of technology, they often lack the precision and patience required for certain types of work. Human slaves with engineering knowledge, the ability to operate complex machinery, or expertise in manufacturing processes may find themselves assigned to relatively stable positions in orc workshops and factories. These skilled slaves can sometimes achieve a level of status that affords them marginally better treatment. Some even become trusted advisors to war bosses or mech boys, though this trust is always conditional and can evaporate in an instant if the orc decides the slave is no longer useful or amusing. The freebooter known as Uzgul the Magnificent, for instance, has been known to keep technical experts from various species as permanent members of his crew, valuing their expertise in maintaining and operating captured technology. Language skills can also provide a small measure of protection. Humans who learn to speak the orc language, or who can translate between different species, may be kept alive longer than others because they serve a useful function in communication. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick famously learned the orc language from a captured raider in his youth, knowledge that would later prove crucial in understanding and fighting orc invasions. Below the skilled slaves are the general laborers, the vast majority of human slaves in orc territory. These are the men, women, and children forced to toil in mines, fields, factories, and construction sites. They have no special skills that set them apart, nothing that makes them individually valuable to their masters. They are interchangeable parts in the orc industrial machine, worked until they can no longer perform their assigned tasks, then discarded like broken tools. General laborers are organized into work gangs, large groups supervised by runthurds who ensure compliance through constant threats and occasional acts of violence. The size of these gangs can vary dramatically, from a few dozen slaves to thousands, depending on the scale of the project and the size of the orc settlement. You might find yourself working alongside people from a dozen different worlds, all thrown together by the random chance of capture. Within work gangs, informal hierarchies often develop among the slaves themselves. Those who have survived longer may have learned tricks for avoiding the worst treatment or for securing slightly better working conditions. They might share this knowledge with newcomers, or they might hoard it jealously, viewing every other slave as competition for the limited safer positions. Trust between slaves is difficult to establish when the orcs deliberately foster an environment of constant fear and competition. At the very bottom of the slave hierarchy are those kept as livestock. These unfortunate souls are not workers at all, but food sources. When an orc civilization grows to sufficient size and complexity while maintaining adequate resources, they may begin breeding imprisoned populations of humans for the sole purpose of being used as food. These human livestock are kept in complete darkness, in communal pens where they can barely move. The only time they see light is when water or food is brought to their enclosures. The conditions in the breeding pens are beyond description. The humans kept there are often modified by orc pain boys, altered until they are barely recognizable as human. During the War of the Beast, in the 32nd millennium, Imperial forces discovered that orcs on the planet Prax had been feeding captured humans steroids and farming them like cattle. The lucky ones had their teeth punched out, were shaved and branded, and then pushed into battle as auxiliary cannon fodder. Those not deemed fit for even this grim purpose were kept as breeding stock, their humanity slowly eroded by genetic manipulation until they were born as insensate, cowering creatures existing solely to be eaten. Understanding your place in this hierarchy is crucial because it helps you navigate the daily realities of slave life. If you possess skills that might be valuable to the orcs, demonstrating them quickly could move you from general labor to a slightly more secure position. If you are assigned to a work gang, learning to read the moods of your run-third overseer and understanding the informal power dynamics among fellow slaves might help you avoid the worst punishments. But there is no safety anywhere in this hierarchy. Even the most valued technical expert can be killed on a whim if an orc finds their work unsatisfactory or simply grows bored with them. The distinction between skilled slave and livestock is not a permanent one. Injuries, age, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time can see you demoted to more dangerous work or thrown into the breeding pens without warning. The orcs do not have formal slave markets or organized systems buying and selling captives. Slaves within the grot slave class do not tend to have any particular owner. Instead, any orc can force any slave into work through cudgels and whips. There are usually no chains or fences keeping slaves confined. The orcs rely on the simple fact that there is nowhere for slaves to run, no escape from orc-held territory that would not result in death from the hostile environment, from feral orcs in the wilderness, or from recapture followed by brutal punishment. This lack of formal ownership creates an environment of constant uncertainty. You might spend weeks working for one orc gang, only to be grabbed by a different group and forced to perform entirely different labor. You have no rights, no way to appeal decisions, no recourse when treated unjustly. You are property that any orc can claim and use as they see fit. Daily life, labor, brutality, and survival. The daily existence of an orc slave is defined by three constants: exhausting labor, casual violence, and the desperate struggle to survive one more day. There are no rest days, no moments of reprieve, no recognition of your need for sleep or sustenance beyond the bare minimum required to keep you functioning. Every waking moment is consumed by work, and sleep, when it comes, offers only brief escape from the nightmare of your reality. Your day typically begins before dawn, if you can even track the passage of time in your current circumstances. In outdoor labor camps, the first light of the sun triggers frantic activity as runthers move through slave pens, using their grot prods and whips to drive workers out toward their assigned tasks. Those who move too slowly feel the electric shock of the grot prod or the sting of the whip across their backs. There is no gentle wake-up, no time to prepare yourself mentally for the day ahead. You wake in pain and move immediately to avoid more pain. The morning meal, if you can call it that, is meager and irregular. Orcs do not understand or care about proper nutrition for their slaves. Food is whatever they happen to have available, often spoiled or contaminated. You might receive a watery gruel made from fungus, a piece of hard bread that tastes like cardboard, or scraps from the orc's own meals. Water is similarly unpredictable, sometimes available in sufficient quantities, other times dangerously scarce. The quality is rarely good, often contaminated with various substances that cause illness among the slave population. Competition for food can be fierce. The Kazi orcs typically dump food into communal areas and let the slaves fight over it. The strong take what they want, while the weak go hungry. This deliberate creation of scarcity serves multiple purposes for the orcs. It reduces the amount of food they need to provide. It keeps the slaves weak and divided, and it provides entertainment as they watch the humans desperately scramble for sustenance. Once work begins, it continues without pause until the orcs decide the day is done. There are no scheduled breaks, no lunch hours, no consideration for exhaustion or injury. You work until you are told to stop, and if you slow down or attempt to rest without permission, punishment comes swiftly. The grot prod delivers shocks that make your muscles spasm uncontrollably. The whip leaves bleeding welts across your back. Physical beatings from runthard grabber sticks, long poles with mechanical pincers at the end, can leave you with broken bones or severe bruising that makes movement agonizing. The Nature of your labor depends on where you have been assigned. In the mines, you might spend 12 or 15 hours bent double in cramped tunnels, digging for ores and minerals with tools that are poorly maintained and dangerous to use. The air is thick with dust that coats your lungs and makes every breath a struggle. Cave-ins are common, burying workers alive while the orcs above simply find replacements to continue the work. In the fields, you toil under whatever sun or stars hang in the alien sky above you, planting and harvesting the crops that feed the orc hordes. Your back aches from constant bending. Your hands bleed from handling rough plants and crude tools. Depending on the world's climate, you might work in scorching heat that causes dehydration and heat stroke, or in freezing cold that leaves you shivering and numb. Factory work presents its own dangers. The machinery used in orc workshops is crude and poorly maintained, lacking even basic safety features. Accidents are commonplace. Workers lose fingers, hands, even entire limbs to the grinding gears and cutting blades. The orcs view these incidents as the workers' fault and show no mercy to the injured. If you cannot work, you are worthless, and worthless slaves do not live long. The ammunition factories are particularly nightmarish. You might spend your days filling shells with explosive compounds, never knowing if the next batch will detonate and vaporize you and everyone around you. The chemicals used in propellants and explosives cause long-term health problems, burning your lungs and skin, causing tremors and weakness that only worsen with continued exposure. The orcs do not provide protective equipment. They do not care if you die from chemical exposure, because there are always more slaves to replace you. Throughout the workday, the threat of violence hangs over every moment. Rundhards patrol the work sites constantly, their squig hounds snapping at anyone who appears to be slacking. These creatures are trained to consume slaves who try to escape or who fail to meet the Rundhard's expectations. Watching a squig hound tear into a fellow slave while the Rundhard laughs is a common occurrence, a reminder of what awaits those who cannot keep up the pace. But it is not just the Rundhards you must fear. Regular orc boys often wander through work areas, and their presence is always dangerous. An orc might decide to use a slave for target practice, testing the accuracy of their crude firearms on living targets. They might grab a slave to use as a demonstration subject for a new weapon they have acquired, curious to see what damage it can inflict. They might simply be in a bad mood and take it out on whatever slave happens to be nearby. The casual nature of this violence is perhaps its most horrifying aspect. To the orcs, killing a slave means nothing. It is not a significant decision that requires justification. It is as casual as swatting an insect or kicking a rock out of your path. You might work beside someone for weeks, only to see them crushed by an orc's power fist because the greenskin found their face annoying. The randomness makes it impossible to feel safe, impossible to relax even for a moment. Physical exhaustion accumulates relentlessly. You are never given adequate time to recover from one day's labor before the next begins. Your muscles develop a constant ache that never quite goes away. Your body begins to break down from the sustained strain. Old injuries do not heal properly because you are never allowed sufficient rest. New injuries pile on top of the old ones, creating a cascade of damage that slowly destroys your ability to function. Medical care is essentially non-existent for slaves. If you are injured but can still work, you will be forced to continue working despite the pain. If you are injured so severely that you cannot work, you will likely be killed and replaced. The concept of healing a slave back to health does not occur to the orcs, or if it does, they dismiss it as inefficient. It is easier to work you to death and capture new slaves than to invest time and resources in maintaining your health. Disease spreads rapidly through slave populations. The crowded, unsanitary conditions in slave pens create perfect breeding grounds for illness. The orcs' complete disregard for hygiene means that contamination is constant. You might be forced to work in areas covered with toxic waste, or to sleep in pens where waste accumulates because the orcs never thought to provide sanitation facilities. When disease breaks out, it can devastate entire work gangs, but the orcs simply wait for it to run its course, then replace the dead with fresh captives. The psychological toll of daily life as an orc slave rivals the physical hardships. Every day requires you to witness horrible things. You watch fellow slaves die from exhaustion, from accidents, from random violence. You hear their screams as they are tortured or eaten. You see children worked to death, the elderly beaten for being too slow, the sick left to die in filth. The accumulation of these traumas weighs on your mind, creating a kind of numbness born from sheer overload. Some slaves break mentally long before their bodies give out. They become hollow shells, moving through the motions of work without really being present. They have retreated into some inner space where the horrors of their reality cannot reach them. The orcs sometimes find these broken slaves amusing and keep them around as a form of entertainment, but more often they simply work them until they stop moving, then discard the body. Others cling desperately to their humanity, trying to maintain some sense of who they were before capture. They might whisper prayers to the emperor during rare moments of privacy. They might help fellow slaves when they can, sharing food or easing someone's burden even at cost to themselves. These small acts of kindness become lifelines, proof that not everything good has been destroyed by orc captivity. The end of the workday brings only marginal relief. You are herded back to the slave pens, usually without having eaten since morning. The pens themselves are crude enclosures, often nothing more than open areas surrounded by scrap metal walls or natural barriers. The orcs do not provide shelter, bedding, or any amenities whatsoever. You sleep on bare ground, pressed against other slaves for warmth if the climate is cold, suffering from heat if it is not. Night offers no safety from orc violence. Patrols continue throughout the darkness, and Runthards may decide to conduct random inspections or punishments. Some orcs view the slave pens as entertainment, wandering through to terrorize the inhabitants, or select victims for various forms of abuse. The screams that echo through the night make sleep difficult, even when exhaustion should make it inevitable. The overseers, Runthards, and their methods of control, the Faun. Runthards, also known as slavers, are the orcs who directly oversee and manage slave populations, and understanding them is crucial to understanding the daily reality of orc slavery. These specialized orcs possess an unusual trait for their species: patience. Where most orcs would rather be fighting and killing, Runthards have the temperament to take care of the menial details of slave management, breeding, and organization. Despite what their role might suggest, Runthards are not kind or gentle masters. They are orcs, which means they are fundamentally cruel, violent, and driven by the need to dominate those weaker than themselves. What sets them apart is not compassion, but rather a calculated approach to brutality. They understand that keeping slaves productive requires a balance between inflicting enough pain to ensure obedience and not causing so much damage that workers become useless. The tools of the Runthard trade are designed specifically for slave control. The most basic is the whip, a simple but effective implement that can deliver painful strikes without necessarily causing permanent injury. Runthards carry whips at all times and use them liberally to direct slave gangs, punish perceived laziness, or simply to remind slaves of their place in the hierarchy. The crack of a Runthard's whip becomes one of the most familiar sounds in a slave's daily existence. More sophisticated is the grabber stick, a long pole outfitted with a pulley-operated Moore-like pincer. This mechanical device can be used in several ways. The Runthard might use it to grab and restrain a slave who is trying to flee or resist, clamping the pincer around their neck or limbs to control their movement. Skilled Runthards can grab a fleeing Gretchen or human slave and hurl them into danger with one smooth motion, perhaps throwing them into a minefield to clear a path, or tossing them toward enemy lines to serve as a distraction during combat. The grabber stick can also be used to throttle slaves who prove too resistant to control. The mechanical pincer tightens around the throat, cutting off air until the victim loses consciousness or dies. The casualness with which Runthards employ this method is chilling. A slave who has been grabbed by a stick knows they are seconds away from death and will typically cease all resistance immediately. Perhaps the most feared tool in a Runthards arsenal is the grot prod, an orc imitation of human electrical cattle prods, but much larger and more powerful. These weapons, created by mech boys and employed by progressive Runthards, can be used to motivate, incapacitate, or even kill, depending on the voltage setting. The tech-savvy Runthards who favor these weapons have learned to use them with disturbing precision, delivering shocks to specific parts of the body to achieve different effects. A low-voltage shock from a grot prod causes intense pain, but no lasting damage, perfect for encouraging a slow worker to move faster or punishing a minor infraction. Medium voltage can cause muscle spasms that leave the victim temporarily unable to move, useful for subduing slaves without killing them. High voltage can stop a heart or cause severe neurological damage, effectively executing the target while maintaining the illusion that it might have been an accident rather than deliberate murder. The grot prod delivers its shock through direct contact. The Runthard must touch the prod to the slave's body, usually targeting areas where the pain will be most intense: the neck, spine, kidneys, or genitals. The arbitrary nature of when and why these shocks are delivered creates an environment of constant fear. You never know when you might feel that horrible jolt of electricity coursing through your body. Never know if this time the Runthard has set the voltage high enough to kill. Runthards also employ living weapons in the form of squighounds. These creatures are a variety of squig, the symbiotic organisms that form part of the orcoid ecosystem, specifically bred and trained to herd and intimidate slaves. Squighounds are voracious predators with powerful jaws full of razor-sharp teeth. They are kept perpetually hungry, making them aggressive and eager to attack any target designated by their Runthard master. The primary function of squighounds is to eat errant or fleeing slaves. When a slave attempts to escape from a work gang or tries to hide during a labor assignment, the Runthard releases the squighounds to hunt them down. The creatures are remarkably effective at tracking human scent, and once they catch their prey, the results are gruesome. The squighound literally devours the escapee alive, often while other slaves are forced to watch. This practice serves a dual purpose. It eliminates the problem of the fleeing slave, while simultaneously terrorizing the remaining workers into obedience. The Runthards call this increasing morale, though what they actually mean is increasing compliance through fear. Watching a fellow slave torn apart by gnashing teeth while screaming in agony is an incredibly effective deterrent against attempting escape. The personality of individual Runthards can vary, but certain traits are nearly universal. All Runthards take pride in their work, viewing themselves as craftsmen who shape and manage their slave herds. They often compete with other Runthards to breed the fiercest grots and the most productive slave gangs, seeing this as a measure of their skill and status. Some Runthards become known across multiple orc settlements for their particularly effective or cruel management techniques. The role of Runthard is hereditary in orc society. They believe themselves descended from families that were cast from the clans in the distant past, though whether this origin story is accurate or simply orc mythology is unclear. This hereditary aspect means that Runthard practices and techniques are passed down through generations, creating lineages of slave management expertise. Besides breeding and managing lower greenskins and captured slaves, Runthards also act as the storytellers and keepers of oral history in orc society. They remember the great battles and famous war bosses of the past, preserving these stories and sharing them during gatherings. This dual role as both slave driver and historian gives Runthards a position of respect within orc settlements that goes beyond their immediate function. For human slaves, learning to read a Runthards' moods and behaviors becomes essential to survival. Each Runthard has their own quirks and preferences, their own triggers that provoke violence or leniency. Some are relatively consistent in their brutality, making them predictable, if not safe. Others are wildly unpredictable, dispensing punishment randomly in ways that make it impossible to avoid their wrath. Some slaves attempt to make themselves useful to their runthird overseer, hoping that demonstrating value will provide a measure of protection. This strategy sometimes works, particularly if you possess skills the runthird finds genuinely useful. A slave who can maintain the runthird's equipment, who can organize work gangs efficiently, or who can communicate the runthird's orders to other slaves, might earn a slightly elevated position within the slave hierarchy. However, this strategy carries significant risks. Becoming too visible to your runthird means attracting their attention, and orc attention is always dangerous. A runthird might decide that a useful slave would be even more entertaining as a target for their latest weapon test. They might grow jealous of a slave who seems too competent, viewing them as a potential threat to their authority. Or they might simply grow bored with you and decide to kill you for amusement, regardless of your usefulness. The relationship between runthirds and their charges is not one of owner and property in the traditional sense. As mentioned earlier, slaves in orc society do not have specific owners. Instead, runthirds manage territories or work projects, and any slaves within their domain fall under their authority. Multiple runthirds might operate within the same settlement, each responsible for different aspects of slave labor or different work gangs. This system creates a strange dynamic where slaves might interact with multiple runthirds during any given day. The runthird who drives you to the mines in the morning might be different from the one who oversees your work there, and both might be different from the one who herds you back to the slave pens at night. Each transition between runthirds represents a moment of uncertainty, a brief period where you must quickly assess the new overseer's mood and adjust your behavior accordingly. The runthird's most powerful weapon, beyond all their physical implements of torture and control, is the atmosphere of fear they cultivate. They are unpredictable in their violence, sometimes letting infractions slide, while brutally punishing actions that seem innocent. This inconsistency is not accidental. It serves to keep slaves in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing what might provoke punishment, always second-guessing every action and decision. Types of labor and work assignments. The variety of work assigned to orc slaves is vast, spanning everything from the most brutal physical labor to specialized technical tasks. Understanding the different types of work and their relative dangers is important for grasping the full scope of the slave experience in orc territory. Mining operations represent some of the most dangerous and physically demanding work. Orc mines are crude affairs, dug with minimal concern for stability or worker safety. The orcs extract whatever minerals and ores their mech boys need for construction and manufacturing, and they do so with the same reckless disregard for consequences that characterizes all their endeavors. As a mining slave, you might be sent deep, underground with only the crudest tools, pickaxes, shovels, perhaps a primitive drill. The tunnels are often poorly supported, prone to collapse at any moment. Rockfalls kill dozens or hundreds of workers regularly, burying them alive beneath tons of stone and earth. The orcs simply dig new tunnels around the collapsed sections, leaving the bodies where they fell. The air quality in orc mines is abysmal. Ventilation is minimal or non-existent, leaving the atmosphere thick with dust and various toxic gases. You breathe in particles that coat your lungs, causing progressive respiratory damage that makes each day harder than the last. Some mines contain naturally occurring toxic minerals that poison workers slowly, causing symptoms like tremors, loss of coordination, and eventually organ failure. Lighting in the mines comes from crude torches or bioluminescent fungus, creating pools of dim illumination separated by vast stretches of darkness. Working in these conditions means you can barely see what you are doing, increasing the risk of accidents and injuries. The darkness also allows for rats, insects, and other creatures to proliferate in the mines, some of them dangerous predators that view weak or isolated workers as prey. Agricultural work, while less immediately dangerous than mining, carries its own hardships. Entire native populations are forced into agricultural labor to manufacture food for the orc hordes. The work is backbreaking and endless, following the cycles of planting, tending, and harvesting with no rest periods between. The crops grown for orc consumption are often varieties of fungus native to the orcoid ecosystem, plants that thrive in conditions that would kill human edible species. Working with these crops exposes you to spores and toxins that cause skin irritation, allergic reactions, and respiratory problems. Some orc crop varieties are aggressive and dangerous in their own right, with thorns, acidic sap, or defensive mechanisms that cause injury to anyone handling them. The tools provided for agricultural work are crude and poorly maintained. You might spend entire days bent over hand tools with broken or missing handles, using your bare hands to pull weeds or harvest crops, because no implements are available. The physical toll of this constant bending and stooping causes chronic back problems that leave you in agony by the end of each day. Factory work encompasses a wide range of activities, all of them dangerous. Some slaves work in munitions plants, filling shells with explosive compounds or assembling the components of orc weapons. The crude nature of orc manufacturing means that accidents are commonplace. Explosions regularly kill entire work crews, and the orcs respond by simply sending in new slaves to continue the work around the charred remains of their predecessors. Other factory slaves work on assembly lines, putting together the various components of orc technology. You might spend 12 hours a day inserting bolts into the same piece of machinery over and over again. Your hands developing calluses and repetitive stress injuries from the monotonous motion. The machinery around you operates without safety guards or emergency stops, and workers who get caught in the gears are simply pulled into the mechanism and crushed, their blood and tissue becoming part of the industrial waste. Chemical work is particularly nightmarish. Some slaves are assigned to work in facilities where propellants, explosives, and other dangerous compounds are manufactured. The exposure to these chemicals causes immediate burns and long-term health problems. Your skin develops rashes and lesions. Your lungs burn with every breath. Your vision deteriorates as the fumes damage your eyes. There is no protective equipment, no ventilation systems, nothing to mitigate the constant exposure to substances that are slowly killing you. Construction work sees slaves building or expanding orc settlements. This might involve hauling massive stones, assembling crude fortifications, or constructing the ramshackle buildings that orcs use for shelter and storage. The work is physically exhausting, requiring you to lift and move objects far heavier than what a healthy human should safely handle. Injuries are constant: crushed fingers, broken bones, hernias from excessive strain. Some slaves are assigned to maintaining orc vehicles and war machines. This can actually be one of the relatively less dangerous assignments, as the orcs need their vehicles functional and may therefore provide slightly better conditions for the mechanics and technicians. However, orc technology is inherently unstable and prone to catastrophic failures. Working on a vehicle that might explode, catch fire, or simply collapse on top of you creates constant stress and frequent casualties. Ammunition manufacturing deserves special attention due to its particularly high fatality rate. Slaves in ammunition plants work with volatile explosives all day, every day. You might be filling shells with unstable compounds, assembling fuses that could detonate at any moment, or packing gunpowder into casings that leak and create explosive dust throughout the facility. One spark, one moment of static electricity, one defective component, and the entire facility can detonate, killing everyone inside. The orcs find this risk acceptable because ammunition is essential to their war machine, and they can always capture more slaves to replace those killed in explosions. From the slave's perspective, working in munitions is essentially a slow-motion death sentence. It is not a question of whether you will die in an explosion, but rather when and how many others will die with you. Waste management, such as it exists in orc settlements, is another assignment that slaves might receive. This involves dealing with the enormous amounts of garbage and refuse that Orc society produces. You might spend your days sorting through toxic waste, trying to identify anything that can be recycled or reused while exposed to all manner of hazardous materials. The smell alone is overwhelming, and the health effects of constant exposure to rotting organic matter and chemical waste are devastating. Some slaves are assigned as personal servants to individual orcs, particularly knobs or important mech boys. This role can range from marginally better to catastrophically worse than general labor, depending entirely on the temperament of the orc you serve. A slave serving a knob might have access to better food and shelter, but they are also constantly in close proximity to an orc who could kill them casually at any moment. The arbitrary nature of orc violence means that personal servants often have shorter lifespans than general laborers, despite their seemingly elevated status. The constant threat of death. In orc captivity, death is not a distant possibility that might someday occur. It is a constant companion, present in every moment of every day, manifesting in countless forms, both sudden and gradual. Understanding the many ways you might die as an orc slave is essential to grasping the full horror of your situation. The most common cause of death is simple exhaustion and overwork. The orcs push their slaves to the absolute limits of physical endurance and beyond. You are worked for 12, 15, sometimes 20 hours a day without adequate food, water, or rest. Your body accumulates damage faster than it can repair itself. Eventually, something critical fails. Your heart gives out from the strain, or your body can no longer maintain basic functions, and you simply collapse. When slaves die from overwork, the orcs rarely even notice immediately. You might fall where you were working, your body left there until someone trips over it, or until the smell becomes noticeable. Then the corpse is dragged away and dumped in whatever area serves as the settlement's mass grave or feeding ground for scavengers. The work continues without pause, your former position in the labor gang filled by the next available slave. Industrial accidents claim vast numbers of slaves. The crude and poorly maintained machinery used throughout orc settlements is inherently dangerous. Safety features are non-existent. Warning systems are absent. Emergency stops do not exist or do not function. When something goes wrong, workers are simply caught in the machinery and destroyed. You might be feeding materials into a processing machine when your sleeve gets caught on a moving part, pulling you in before you can react. The machine grinds on, crushing and mangling your body while you scream, until you stop moving and become just another piece of debris that needs to be cleared away. Your fellow slaves continue working around your remains, unable to help, knowing they might be next. Explosions are another frequent killer, particularly in ammunition plants and certain types of factories. The volatile materials being handled with poor quality control and crude manufacturing processes create conditions where catastrophic failures are almost inevitable. Of propellant might detonate, vaporizing everyone within the blast radius. A fuel rupture and ignite, creating a fireball that consumes entire buildings full of workers. These explosions can kill dozens or hundreds at once, but the orcs view them as acceptable losses. The ammunition needs to be manufactured, the work must continue, and there are always more slaves to replace those killed. You might work in a munitions plant, knowing that similar facilities have exploded multiple times before, knowing that the same fate almost certainly awaits you, yet having no choice but to continue your assigned tasks. Disease and infection kill more slaves than most people would suspect. The unsanitary conditions, lack of medical care, and constant exposure to toxins and contaminants create perfect conditions for illness to spread. A simple cut that becomes infected can become a death sentence when there is no treatment available. Dysentery from contaminated water or food kills slowly and painfully, leaving you weak and dehydrated as you continue to be forced to work. Epidemics can sweep through slave populations with devastating speed. Crowded pens where hundreds of slaves are pressed together in filth, sharing the same contaminated water and breathing the same disease-filled air, allow illnesses to spread rapidly. The orcs do not quarantine sick slaves or attempt to stop disease transmission. They simply let the epidemic run its course, then replace the dead with fresh captives. Starvation is a slower but equally certain killer. The orcs provide minimal food to their slaves, just enough to keep most of them functional for a while. But most is not all, and there are always slaves who receive less than even this meager ration. Competition for food means some slaves are simply outcompeted by stronger individuals and slowly starve to death over weeks or months. The physical effects of prolonged starvation are horrible. Your body consumes its own tissues for energy, breaking down muscle and organ tissue to keep your brain and heart functioning. You become skeletal, your skin stretched tight over bones, your eyes sunken into your skull. Even basic tasks become monumentally difficult as your strength fails. Eventually, your body can no longer sustain itself, and you die, often while still being forced to work right up until the moment your heart stops. Exposure to the elements kills many slaves, particularly those working in outdoor assignments on worlds with harsh climates. If you are working on a frozen world, the cold saps your strength and causes frostbite that destroys fingers, toes, and other extremities. Hypothermia sets in when you are no longer able to maintain your core temperature, causing confusion, loss of coordination, and finally death as your body systems shut down. On hot worlds, heatstroke and dehydration are constant threats. The orcs do not provide adequate water or shade. You work under the blazing sun hour after hour, your body's cooling mechanisms overwhelmed by the temperature. When heat stroke occurs, your brain essentially begins to cook inside your skull, causing hallucinations, seizures, and eventual death. Random orc violence is perhaps the most psychologically devastating cause of death because of its complete arbitrariness. An orc might kill you because they are testing a new weapon and want to see what it does to a human body. They might kill you because you looked at them wrong, or because they are in a bad mood, or because they find your suffering entertaining. They might kill you for no reason at all, simply grabbing you as you walk past and crushing your skull with their bare hands before moving on to whatever they were doing. This randomness means there is no way to protect yourself through good behavior or careful attention to orc moods. You can do everything right, work hard, avoid attention, stay out of trouble, and still die simply because an orc wandering past decided to kill someone and you happen to be nearby. This knowledge creates a state of constant grinding anxiety that wears down your psychological defenses. Being eaten is a fate that awaits many slaves. Orcs regularly torture and eat humans, sometimes cooking them beforehand, sometimes simply consuming them raw. This can range from an orc picking one slave to eat when they feel hungry, to industrial-scale food production, where entire facilities are dedicated to processing human flesh as food. The process of being selected for consumption is terrifying. The orcs might simply grab whoever is nearest, or they might make a game of it, having slaves fight each other with the loser being eaten. Sometimes they cook their victims slowly over fires while they are still alive, finding the screams entertaining. Other times they simply tear into living flesh with their teeth, the victim dying slowly from blood loss and trauma while being devoured. In some orc settlements that have reached sufficient size and complexity, humans are bred specifically for consumption in what amounts to industrial livestock production. These breeding pens keep humans in complete darkness, in communal enclosures where they can barely move. The inhabitants are modified by orc pain boys until they are barely recognizable as human, born without teeth, hair, or nails, existing as insensate, cowering creatures whose only purpose is to be eaten. Gladiatorial combat claims slaves who are forced to fight each other or alien creatures for orc entertainment. The orcs enjoy watching fights, and they often create opportunities for such spectacles by throwing slaves into pits or arenas with weapons and forcing them to battle. The loser dies, obviously, but even the winner rarely survives long, as they will be forced to fight again and again until they eventually lose. Some slaves die attempting to escape. The desperation of their situation drives them to try fleeing despite the near impossibility of success. Squighounds hunt them down and tear them apart. Orc patrols catch them and kill them as examples to other slaves. Even if they somehow evade immediate capture, the hostile environment of most orc-held worlds makes long-term survival impossible without resources and support. Punishment executions serve as examples to other slaves and as entertainment for the orcs. Slaves who displease their masters might be killed in elaborate and painful ways, specifically designed to terrorize the remaining population. Public tortures, where slaves are slowly killed over hours or days, while other workers are forced to watch, create an atmosphere that keeps the broader slave population compliant. Psychological torment and orc psychology. The physical hardships of orc slavery are matched, and perhaps exceeded, by the psychological torture inherent in every aspect of the experience. Understanding the mental and emotional toll of captivity requires understanding orc psychology and how profoundly alien it is from human thinking. Orcoid psychology is utterly different from that of humans, to the point where they can simultaneously believe two contradictory facts without experiencing any cognitive dissonance. This ability to hold conflicting ideas represents a fundamental difference in how orcs process information and understand reality. It makes them unpredictable and incomprehensible to human slaves trying to anticipate their behavior or find logical patterns in their actions. Orcs have no concept of love as humans understand it. They find human affection strange and inexplicable, viewing emotional bonds between people as a weakness to be exploited. What orcs do experience is a kind of battle bliss, an ecstatic state that occurs during combat. They associate this feeling with both love and hate, blurring the distinction between the two in ways that make no sense to human psychology. This absence of empathy or emotional connection means that orcs literally cannot understand why their treatment of slaves might be wrong. They do not recognize the suffering they inflict as suffering in any meaningful sense. To them, humans are weak creatures whose screams and pleas are merely noise, no more significant than the sounds made by malfunctioning machinery. Your pain means nothing to them because they are incapable of recognizing it as something that matters. The arbitrary nature of orc behavior creates constant psychological stress for slaves. There is no pattern to discern, no rules to learn that might help you avoid punishment or death. An orc might walk past you 100 times without incident, then crush your head on the 101st time for no reason you can perceive. This randomness makes it impossible to develop coping mechanisms based on understanding and predicting your captor's behavior. Orc humor, such as it is, often involves the suffering of weaker beings. They find it entertaining when slaves are injured, when accidents occur, when torture produces particularly creative screams. To witness something horrible happening to a fellow slave and see your orc overseers laughing about it creates a profound sense of helplessness and despair. You are trapped in a nightmare run by creatures who view your torment as comedy. The linguistic and cultural barrier between humans and orcs adds another layer of psychological difficulty. Even if you learn some of the orc language, which few slaves manage, the fundamental differences in worldview make true communication nearly impossible. Orcs express themselves primarily through violence and displays of strength. Nuanced concepts like mercy, fairness, or justice do not exist in their vocabulary or their thinking. This inability to communicate or reason with your captors means there is no avenue for appeal, no way to advocate for better treatment or to negotiate for any improvement in your circumstances. You are completely at their mercy, and they have no mercy to give. Every interaction is dictated purely by their whims and their assessment of whether you are useful enough to keep alive at that particular moment. The loss of identity is one of the most devastating psychological effects of orc slavery. The orcs do not learn your name. They do not care about your history, your skills, your relationships, anything that made you who you were before capture. You are reduced to a generic grot, interchangeable with every other slave, valuable only for the labor you can perform. This erasure of identity undermines your sense of self at a fundamental level. Without anyone acknowledging who you are or who you were, it becomes harder to maintain that sense of self internally. Some slaves cling desperately to memories of their former lives, rehearsing them mentally to keep them alive. Others find those memories too painful and try to suppress them, focusing only on immediate survival. Both strategies carry psychological costs. The constant witnessing of atrocity takes an accumulating toll. Every day brings fresh horrors: slaves killed in accidents, executed for minor infractions, tortured for entertainment, selected for consumption. You watch children worked to death, see the elderly beaten until their bones break, witness pregnant women forced to labor until they miscarry. The human mind is not designed to process this level of sustained trauma, and the psychological damage builds over time. Some slaves develop a kind of emotional numbness, a dissociative state where they function mechanically without really being present. They have retreated so far inside themselves that the external horror cannot reach them anymore. This psychological strategy allows them to continue functioning, but at the cost of losing connection to their own humanity. They become shells, moving through the motions of survival without really living. Others maintain their emotional connection to what is happening around them, feeling the full weight of every horror they witness. This keeps them more psychologically present and human, but the cost is enormous. The grief, rage, and despair that come from truly feeling the scope of what is being done to them and their fellow slaves can be overwhelming. Many slaves in this state eventually reach a breaking point where they simply give up, ceasing to care whether they live or die. The absence of hope is perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of orc slavery. There is no realistic prospect of rescue. The Imperium does not negotiate for prisoners or launch rescue missions for enslaved civilians. Your world has fallen, your people are scattered or dead, and the vast machinery of Imperial governance has already written you off as a loss. Even if Imperial forces eventually retake the territory where you are held, you will likely be long dead by then, or so broken that recovery is impossible. Escape is nearly impossible for reasons both practical and psychological. Even if you could somehow evade the Rundhards, the Squighounds, and the Orc patrols, where would you go? You are on an alien world or in Orc-held territory with no resources, no allies, no support systems. The hostile environment would likely kill you even if you managed to get away from the Orcs themselves. And after weeks or months of slavery, your body is so damaged and weakened that you lack the physical capacity for the demands of escape and survival in the wilderness. The psychological impact of knowing that this is your life now, that there will be no dramatic rescue or escape, that you will likely die here as a slave, crushed or starved or worked to death, creates a despair so deep that it becomes difficult to articulate. Some slaves lose the will to survive, ceasing to eat even when food is available, provoking their overseers in hopes of being killed quickly rather than dying slowly from accumulated damage. Yet even in the depths of this despair, some slaves find small ways to maintain their humanity and sanity. They form bonds with fellow slaves, creating support networks based on shared suffering. They perform small acts of kindness when possible, sharing food or helping injured workers, even when doing so puts them at risk. They whisper prayers to the Emperor during rare moments of privacy, maintaining whatever faith they can in the face of evidence that suggests they have been abandoned by both the Imperium and the Divine. These small acts of resistance and humanity become crucial to psychological survival. They are proof that the orcs have not completely destroyed everything good, that some portion of human dignity and compassion persists even in the worst circumstances imaginable. For some slaves, maintaining these connections and behaviors becomes their primary purpose, the thing that keeps them going when pure survival instinct might not be enough. The breeding pens and livestock status. Among all the horrors of orc slavery, perhaps none is more fundamentally dehumanizing than the practice of keeping humans as livestock. When orc civilizations grow to sufficient size and complexity while maintaining adequate resources, they sometimes begin breeding imprisoned populations of humans for the sole purpose of being used as food. Understanding this practice requires confronting one of the darkest aspects of orc society and what it reveals about how they view other species. The breeding pens represent the ultimate degradation, a fate that strips away every last vestige of human dignity and reduces people to nothing more than meat to be harvested. Those consigned to these facilities experience conditions that go beyond mere slavery into territory that challenges the limits of human comprehension and endurance. The physical conditions in breeding pens are deliberately designed to maximize yield while minimizing the resources required to maintain the human livestock. Inhabitants are kept in complete darkness, a choice that serves multiple purposes. The absence of light reduces the amount of energy the humans need to maintain their circadian rhythms and visual processing systems. It also creates a state of sensory deprivation that pacifies the population, making them less likely to resist or cause problems. The pens themselves are communal enclosures where dozens or hundreds of humans are pressed together in spaces far too small for the population. There is no room to move freely, no privacy, no escape from the constant press of other bodies. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed flesh, human waste, and fear. The only time the inhabitants see light is when food or water is brought to their enclosures, brief moments of illumination that reveal the true horror of their surroundings before darkness returns. The modifications performed on breeding pen inhabitants by orc painboys represent some of the most disturbing examples of orc biotechnology. The goal is to create humans who are more efficient as food sources, less troublesome to manage, faster to mature, with more edible mass relative to their overall size. The methods used to achieve these goals are nightmarish. During the War of the Beast, in the 32nd millennium, Imperial forces who liberated breeding facilities on the planet Prax discovered the extent of these modifications. The humans being kept as livestock had been altered until they were barely recognizable as human. They were born without teeth, hair, or nails, their development arrested at a stage where these features had not yet formed. Their minds had been similarly stunted, leaving them as insensate, cowering creatures incapable of complex thought or resistance. The modifications extend beyond mere appearance. The musculature and metabolism of breeding pen humans are altered to promote rapid weight gain and to convert nutrients into edible tissue more efficiently. Their digestive systems are simplified, allowing them to survive on the cheapest possible feed. Their nervous systems are sometimes dulled, reducing their capacity for suffering, or at least their ability to express it in ways that might disturb even orc sensibilities. The breeding program itself is conducted with the same crude efficiency that characterizes all orc endeavors. Humans are paired for reproduction based on whatever criteria the painboys and rundhards deem important, with no consideration for the individuals involved. Pregnancies are monitored only to the extent necessary to ensure live births. The newborns are immediately separated from their mothers and placed into the system of communal raising that will prepare them for their eventual slaughter. The psychological state of breeding pen inhabitants is difficult to assess because the modifications they have undergone have fundamentally altered their capacity for thought and feeling. The original generations, those captured and placed into the pens with their full mental faculties intact, experience a descent into madness as they realize what is being done to them and what will be done to their children. The subsequent generations, born into darkness and modified before they can develop normally, may lack the cognitive capacity to understand their situation, which might be a mercy, or might be the cruelest aspect of their fate. The feeding of breeding pen populations is done with the same minimal investment of resources that characterizes orc slave management elsewhere. The food provided is whatever is cheapest and most readily available, often waste products from other aspects of orc industry, or crops grown specifically as livestock feed. The nutritional content is sufficient to keep the inhabitants alive and growing, but no thought is given to their comfort or health beyond what is necessary to maintain them as viable food sources. Water is similarly provided at minimal levels. The communal nature of the Shan pens means that contamination is constant, with water sources serving as vectors for disease transmission. Infections and illnesses spread rapidly through the population, but the orcs simply accept this as a normal aspect of livestock management, replacing the dead and sick with new stock. The eventual slaughter of breeding pen inhabitants is conducted with the same casual brutality that characterizes orc behavior toward all slaves. Some are taken individually as needed, selected at random or based on size and weight. Others might be processed in larger numbers if the orc population is preparing for a major campaign and needs to build up food stores. The methods of slaughter vary, but they rarely include any consideration for minimizing suffering or ensuring quick death. Not all humans kept as livestock are confined to breeding pens. Some orc settlements practice a more dispersed form of human cattle ranching, where groups of humans are kept in outdoor enclosures or designated areas and raised under slightly less horrific conditions than the breeding pens. These humans might be used for different purposes, some for meat, some for leather, and other products derived from human tissue, some for experimental subjects in painboy surgeries. The fortunate individuals in these more traditional livestock arrangements still face a grim existence, but they at least maintain some connection to sensory experience and the outside world. They can see the sky, feel the weather, interact with other humans in ways that allow for the development of relationships and social structures. Their eventual fate remains the same as those in the breeding pens, but the journey to that fate is marginally less horrific. During the War of the Beast, some humans kept as livestock were given a different purpose. After being fed steroids and other substances to increase their muscle mass, they had their teeth punched out, were shaved, branded, and then pushed into battle as auxiliary cannon, fodder. This represents a variation on the livestock theme, where the meat is used for a different purpose before slaughter, sent to fight and die in orc battles rather than simply being processed for consumption. The existence of breeding pens and human livestock operations reveals important truths about orc psychology and society. It demonstrates their complete lack of empathy or moral consideration for other species. Humans are not enemies to be fought honorably, not even slaves to be worked until exhaustion. They are resources to be exploited, no different from the fungus the snotlings cultivate, or the squigs the orcs raise for various purposes. Resistance, escape, and their consequences. In the face of overwhelming oppression and seemingly impossible odds, some slaves attempt to resist their orc masters or escape from captivity. Understanding these efforts and their almost universal failure is essential to grasping the complete picture of orc slavery and why it represents such an absolute form of bondage. Active resistance within orc settlements is extremely difficult for several reasons. First, slaves are worked to near exhaustion every day, leaving them with minimal energy for planning or executing resistance activities. Second, the constant presence of runthirds and orc patrols makes secret meetings or organization nearly impossible. Third, the orcs maintain an atmosphere of suspicion and competition among slaves, making it difficult to know who can be trusted with information about potential resistance plans. Despite these obstacles, resistance does occur, typically in small, desperate actions rather than organized rebellions. A slave might sabotage equipment they are working on, causing delays or failures in orc operations. Another might steal food or supplies and distribute them to other slaves, slightly ameliorating the constant hunger and deprivation. Some attempt to help injured or sick fellow slaves, providing comfort and basic care when the orcs provide none. These small acts of resistance rarely have any significant impact on orc operations, but they serve an important psychological function. They are assertions of agency, proof that the slaves are not completely powerless, that some choices still remain even in the depths of captivity. For the individuals involved, these actions can provide a sense of purpose and dignity that helps maintain sanity in an insane situation. The consequences for resistance, when discovered, are severe. The orcs respond to any act of defiance with brutal and disproportionate violence, not just to punish the specific individual, but to terrorize the entire slave population into compliance. A slave caught sabotaging equipment might be publicly tortured to death over the course of hours or days, their screams serving as a warning to others. A theft of food might result in the execution of an entire work gang, making an example that deters future attempts. Escape attempts are more common than organized resistance, driven by the desperate hope that freedom might somehow be achievable, despite all evidence to the contrary. Slaves plan their escapes during rare moments of privacy, hoarding whatever supplies they can secretly gather, studying the patterns of patrols and guard rotations, looking for any weakness in the security that keeps them confined. The practical obstacles to escape are numerous and severe. Most orc settlements are located in hostile environments, where survival without proper equipment and supplies is nearly impossible. The worlds may have toxic atmospheres, extreme temperatures, dangerous wildlife, or other environmental hazards that make wilderness survival a death sentence. Even on more hospitable worlds, the lack of food, water, and shelter quickly becomes fatal to escaped slaves whose bodies are already weakened by months or years of hard labor and poor nutrition. The orcs themselves represent the most significant obstacle to escape. Runthered patrols, with their squighounds, cover the areas around slave quarters and work sites. The squighounds are trained trackers, capable of following human scent across long distances. Once they pick up the trail of an escapee, they pursue relentlessly until they catch and kill their prey. Orc boys also patrol the perimeters of settlements and work sites, and while they may not be as systematic as Runthered patrols, they are far more dangerous if encountered. An orc who discovers an escaping slave will typically kill them on the spot, either with weapons or bare hands. Some orcs find the hunt entertaining and will deliberately allow escapees a head start before pursuing them for sport. The few slaves who manage to evade immediate capture face the problem of where to go. On orc-held worlds, there are no friendly settlements where a human might find sanctuary. The entire planet is hostile territory, and any orcs encountered will either kill you or return you to slavery. On worlds not fully conquered by orcs, feral orc tribes proliferate in wilderness areas, making those regions equally dangerous. Even if a slave could somehow reach Imperial-held territory, which would require crossing vast distances through hostile terrain, they would likely be treated with suspicion by Imperial authorities. Long-term exposure to orc captivity might lead to quarantine or even execution, as the Imperium fears potential corruption or contamination from prolonged contact with Xenos. The harsh reality is that escaped slaves often face persecution, even from their own people. The most famous example of successful slave resistance occurred when Commissar Sebastian Yarrick was captured by Gazgukul Thraka after the Battle of Golgotha. Yarrick endured grueling torture and forced labor aboard Gazgukul's Space Hulk before leading a slave revolt that allowed him and other captives to escape. This event is nearly unique in the annals of orc slavery, remarkable precisely because it is so unusual for any slave to successfully resist orc captivity, let alone a figure as prominent as Yarrick. Yarrick's success can be attributed to several exceptional factors: his personal combat prowess, his understanding of orc psychology from years of fighting them, his natural leadership abilities, and the peculiar respect that Gazkul himself had developed for the commissar. These circumstances were so unusual that they cannot reasonably be replicated by ordinary slaves, making Yarrick's escape more of an exception that proves the rule than a model that others might follow. More commonly, resistance, failure, and death. The orcs ensure that these failures are public and horrific, using them as opportunities to reinforce the futility of resistance among the broader slave population. Public executions of escaped slaves are common, conducted with maximum cruelty to create a spectacle that terrorizes other captives into compliance. The psychological impact of witnessing failed escapes is devastating. Each attempt that ends in the escapee's brutal death reinforces the sense of hopelessness that pervades slave populations. It demonstrates that even the bravest and most resourceful individuals cannot overcome the barriers to freedom, that the cage is simply too strong to break. This accumulation of failed attempts can crush the morale of entire work gangs, leaving them resigned to their fate. Some slaves choose a different form of escape: suicide. When the pain and degradation become unbearable, when there seems to be no prospect of anything ever improving, some slaves deliberately end their own lives. Methods vary depending on what opportunities present themselves: stepping in front of dangerous machinery, provoking an orc into killing them, refusing to eat until starvation takes them, or finding some other means to achieve death. The orcs generally do not care if slaves commit suicide, viewing it as simply one more form of weakness that culls the unsuitable from their labor force. They make no particular effort to prevent suicide beyond the practical concern that too many deaths might reduce the workforce below functional levels. In some cases, orcs find slave suicide amusing, particularly if the method chosen is dramatic or painful. The question of whether resistance is worthwhile, given its near-certain failure and terrible consequences, haunts many slaves. On one hand, resistance maintains dignity and agency, providing psychological benefits that can be crucial to maintaining sanity. On the other hand, it invites brutal retaliation that might kill not just the resistor, but other innocent slaves as well. The ethical calculus is impossibly complex, with no clear right answer. Variations. Different orc clans and their slave treatment. The experience of orc slavery can vary significantly depending on which orc clan holds you captive. While all orc clans share fundamental characteristics and behaviors, each clan has its own cultural identity and priorities that influence how they treat their slaves. The Goths are the largest and most aggressive clan, representing the orky ideal in its purest form. Goths are loud, violent, and obsessed with close combat and physical prowess. For slaves, being held by Goths generally means being subjected to particularly brutal treatment, as these orcs have the least patience for anything they perceive as weakness. Goth slaves are often used as sparring partners or practice targets, forced into fights with each other or with other creatures purely for orc entertainment. The Bad Moons are the richest orc clan, obsessed with accumulating wealth and displaying it ostentatiously. They have more teeth, the orc currency, than any other clan, which means they can afford to maintain larger slave populations and more extensive operations. Bad Moon slaves might find themselves working in more organized other clans, as the Bad Moon's relative wealth allows, for slightly more systematic exploitation. However, this organization does not translate to better treatment, merely more efficient extraction of labor. Blood axes are the most willing to learn from other species and adopt their tactics. They are viewed with suspicion by other orcs because they will even work as mercenaries for non-orcs, though they typically betray their employers eventually. Blood axe slaves might encounter slightly more predictable treatment patterns, as these orcs have adopted some aspects of military discipline and organization from observing human armies. However, they are still fundamentally orcs, and their treatment of slaves remains brutal by any civilized standard. Death Skulls believe that blue brings luck and are known for looting and stealing from everyone. including other orcs. They are the most likely to scavenge and repurpose everything they can find, which extends to their use of slaves. Death Skull slaves often work in salvage operations, picking through battlefields and ruins for anything that might be valuable. The work is dangerous, as unexploded ordnance and unstable structures are common in such environments, but it can sometimes offer brief moments of relative freedom as slaves spread out across salvage sites. Evil Sons are obsessed with speed and vehicles, believing that red makes everything go faster. They favor massive numbers of bikes, buggies, and other fast-moving transports. Slaves under Evil Sons might find themselves working primarily in vehicle maintenance and manufacturing, or they might be used as pit crews for orc races. The fast-paced and chaotic nature of Evil Sons culture means that accidents are particularly common, with slaves regularly crushed by vehicles or caught in crashes. Snakebites are the most traditionalist orc clan, rejecting much of the technology that other clans embrace. They prefer beast riding and primitive weapons over guns and vehicles. Slaves under Snakebite control might be assigned to care for the various creatures the clan breeds and trains for war, including massive squiggoths and other dangerous beasts. This work carries its own unique risks, as the creatures are unpredictable and often view slaves as potential prey. Freebooters are not technically a clan, but rather a collection of orc pirates and mercenaries who have been exiled or who chose to leave their original clans. They are fleet-based, using ships to traverse the galaxy and engage in piracy and raiding. The freebooter captain, known as Uzgul the Magnificent, has expressed preferences in slave species, favoring Eldar over humans because Eldar typically survive longer and have hidden reserves of strength for forced labor. Uzgul holds the spirit stones of Eldar slaves hostage as leverage to ensure compliance, demonstrating the calculating cruelty that some freebooters employ. The variation in treatment between clans should not be overstated. All orc clans fundamentally view slaves as disposable resources to be exploited until death. The differences are matters of degree and focus rather than fundamental approach. A slave under Bad Moons might have slightly more predictable working conditions than one under Goths, but both will experience brutal treatment, constant danger, and eventual death as the most likely outcome. Location also affects the slave experience beyond just which clan is in control. Slaves on Orc space hulks face unique challenges. Space hulks are massive conglomerations of ships that have been fused together by warp energies, creating unstable and dangerous environments. Atmospheric integrity is often compromised. Radiation leaks are common, and the twisted geometry of the fused ships creates countless hazards. Slaves working aboard space hulks must navigate these dangers while performing their assigned tasks. Slaves on Orc-controlled planets face different challenges depending on the world's characteristics. On hive worlds or urban centers, slaves might work in factories and industrial centers. On agricultural worlds, they toil in fields. On mining worlds, they descend into the depths of the earth to extract resources. Each environment presents its own specific dangers and hardships. The scale of the orc settlement also matters. Small orc encampments might have only a few dozen or 100 slaves, all pressed into whatever labor is needed with minimal organization. Large orc empires, like the one created by the Beast in the 32nd millennium, employ millions of slaves across multiple worlds, with relatively sophisticated systems for managing and deploying this labor force. During major YHIEH campaigns, when orc populations reach critical mass and launch massive interstellar migrations, entire native planetary populations are forced into slavery merely to manufacture ammunition for the Horde's guns. The scale of these operations is staggering, with billions of humans potentially enslaved across dozens or hundreds of worlds, all feeding the insatiable appetite of the orc war machine. Historical examples and known cases. Throughout the long and violent history of Imperial Orc conflict, numerous well-documented instances of orc slavery have been recorded. These cases provide concrete examples of the general patterns and practices described throughout this examination, giving faces and names to what might otherwise remain abstract horrors. The Second War for Armageddon provides one of the most thoroughly documented examples of orc enslavement of human populations. When warlord Ghazghkull Thraka's forces overwhelmed Hive Infernus in 941, the subsequent surrender delivered hundreds of thousands of humans directly into orc captivity. The refugee columns that stretched across Armageddon's desert wastelands, harried by speed freak biker units, represented one of the largest forced migrations of the modern imperial era. These refugees were driven back to Hive Infernus to work as slaves in the orc war machine, the Worm. Industrial capacity of the Hive was turned toward producing munitions, weapons, and supplies for Ghazghkull's continuing campaign. Human slaves operated the foundries, assembled the weapons, and loaded the ammunition that would be used against their own people in the defense of Hades' Hive and other imperial strongholds. The psychological torture of being forced to aid in your own civilization's destruction added another layer to the physical suffering of slavery. Commissar Yarrick's own capture and enslavement aboard Ghazghkull's Space Hulk 3 years after the Second War demonstrates that even the most formidable imperial heroes are not immune to the horrors of orc captivity. After his defeat at Golgotha in 944, Yarrick endured grueling torture and forced labor alongside other captured humans. His eventual leadership of a slave revolt and escape represents an extraordinary achievement that has entered into imperial legend, but it also illustrates just how exceptional such outcomes are. The planet Letum in the Calixis sector provides a more recent example of orc slave practices. Following its conquest by Wa'arg Grimtuf, the entire surviving population of this temperate, fertile world was forced into slavery. Work camps were established in the planet's fields, mines, and foundries. Human labor now fuels the orc war machine, with every crop harvested and every mineral extracted going towards sustaining the Warg's ongoing expansion. The surviving population of Letum endures a daily regime of forced labor and surveillance. Slaves are herded from pens to labor sites and back again under threat of violence or execution. Constant supervision by orc forces and their underlings prevents any organized resistance or communication beyond the planet. The complete isolation of these slaves, cut off from imperial contact or hope of rescue, represents a common pattern in orc-held territories. The War of the Beast, in the 32nd millennium, represents perhaps the largest and most organized example of orc slavery in recorded history. The Orc Empire created during this period achieved a level of sophistication unprecedented before or since. On the planet Prax, imperial forces discovered extensive evidence of industrial-scale human slavery and livestock production. The orcs on Prax had been evolving faster than anticipated, developing their own society with specialists and organization. They actively conquered and enslaved humans, feeding them steroids and farming them like cattle. Some were kept as breeding stock, modified until they were barely recognizable as human. Others had their teeth punched out, were shaved and branded, then pushed into battle as auxiliary cannon fodder. The scale and systematic nature of these operations shocked even hardened imperial forces used to the horrors of war. The war boss, Hruk Teef Splinter of the Snakebites clan, provides another notable example. Hruk enslaved the entire population of the binary, System Corva, his old stomping grounds. He forced his captives to build him spacecraft, with holds cavernous enough to accommodate his beloved mega menagerie of creatures. This represents a case where slave labor was employed for a specific, large-scale construction project at the whim of an individual war boss. Throughout the Armageddon conflicts, smaller-scale enslavements occurred constantly. Thousands of imperial citizens who attempted to flee advancing orc forces were captured by speed cults, the fast attack units that circle hive cities like buzzards waiting for prey. These captives were distributed among various orc mobs for use in different capacities, from mine workers to factory laborers to personal servants for orc nobs. The freebooter Uzgul the Magnificent's admitted preference for Eldar slaves over human ones provides insight into how some orcs think about the relative value of different species as labor sources. Uzgul notes that humans typically survive for only a short time and need to be replaced frequently, while Eldar slaves have a greater will to live and hidden strength for forced labor work. His practice of holding Eldar spirit stones hostage as leverage demonstrates a level of psychological manipulation unusual among orcs, but not unique. Lesser-known cases exist throughout imperial records, brief mentions in military reports or administrative documents that hint at the broader scope of orc slavery. References to liberated slaves found in reclaimed territories, their minds and bodies shattered by their experiences. Reports of work camps discovered and destroyed during imperial offensives, the emaciated survivors barely recognizable as human. Accounts from interrogations of captured orcs that casually mention slaves as just another resource they manage alongside ammunition and fuel. These historical examples collectively paint a picture of slavery as a fundamental and enduring aspect of orc civilization. It is not an aberration or an occasional practice, but rather a core component of how orcs organize their societies and conduct their wars. Wherever orcs conquer, slavery follows, as inevitable as the spores they release and the violence they perpetuate. Conclusion: to be enslaved by orcs in the grim darkness of the far future is to experience a form of suffering that challenges the limits of human endurance and comprehension. It is a descent into a hell where every day brings fresh horrors, where survival is measured in hours rather than weeks, and where death, when it finally comes, is often welcomed as a mercy. The physical torments are immense, the back-breaking labor that continues until your body fails, the constant beatings and casual violence, the inadequate food and water, the complete lack of medical care or basic sanitation. Your body accumulates damage faster than it can heal, slowly breaking down under the relentless strain until some critical system fails and you die. Another statistic in the endless churn of orc slavery. But perhaps even worse than the physical suffering is the psychological torture. The complete erasure of your identity and dignity, the reduction of your existence to nothing more than a resource to be exploited and discarded. The constant witnessing of atrocity, the accumulation of trauma that no human mind was designed to process. The crushing despair that comes from understanding that rescue will not arrive, that escape is impossible, that this nightmare is your life now until death finally releases you. The arbitrary nature of orc violence, the complete absence of rules or patterns you might use to protect yourself, creates an environment where psychological defense mechanisms break down. You can do everything right and still die randomly because an orc happened to walk past in a bad mood. You can survive for months through skill and luck, only to be selected for consumption or gladiatorial combat for reasons beyond your understanding or control. The variations between orc clans and locations provide different flavors of misery, but no real escape from the fundamental horror. Whether you are worked to death in a mine, processed as livestock, or forced to build weapons that will be used against your own people, the end result is the same. You suffer, you die, and the orcs move on to the next conquest, the next harvest of slaves, the endless cycle continuing without pause or mercy. Yet even in this darkest corner of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, some slaves maintain their humanity. They perform small acts of kindness, help their fellow captives when they can, whisper prayers to the Emperor, and refuse to let the orcs completely destroy the core of who they are. These acts of resistance, however small, represent the indomitable nature of the human spirit, the refusal to be completely broken, even when every force is aligned toward that end. The stories of orc slavery serve as a reminder of what the Imperium fights against: why the endless wars and terrible sacrifices are deemed necessary by those who govern humanity. The orcs are not enemies who might be reasoned with or negotiated with. They are a fundamental threat to human existence, a species whose very nature demands that they conquer, enslave, and destroy everything in their path. For the billions of Imperial citizens who will never face orc captivity, understanding these horrors provides context for the constant vigilance and military preparedness that the Imperium demands. Better to die fighting than to live as a slave. Better to endure the hardships of Imperial service than to experience the incomparable suffering that awaits those who fall into orc hands. And for those reading this who might someday face the possibility of capture by orcs, the message is clear. Resist with every fiber of your being, fight to the last breath, and if capture seems inevitable, consider that a quick death in battle might be preferable to the prolonged torment that awaits in orc captivity. The Imperium does not judge those who make such choices, understanding that there are fates worse than death, and that orc slavery represents one of the absolute worst fates imaginable in a galaxy full of horrors. The Emperor protects, they say, but sometimes his protection comes in the form of a quick death rather than deliverance from captivity. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, sometimes the greatest mercy is to be granted release from suffering rather than to endure it without end. If you found this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40,000's darkest topics informative, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Hit that notification bell to stay updated on future lore explorations as we continue to examine the grim darkness of the far future. The Emperor protects. There are certain truths in the Imperium of Man that remain constant across 1,000,000 worlds and 10,000 years of history. The Emperor protects. Duty is its own reward. In death, service continues. But there is another truth, one whispered in the darkness of the Underhive, one that keeps even the most faithful awake in their sleep cycles. It is the truth that there are fates worse than death, horrors so complete and absolute that death would be a mercy long denied. To understand what it means to live on a hive world being consumed by tyrannids, you must first understand what it means to exist in one of humanity's greatest monuments and most terrible prisons. You must comprehend the scale of these towering arcologies, the billions upon billions of souls packed into structures that scrape the very clouds. You must feel the recycled air in your lungs, taste the corpse starch on your tongue, and know that everything you are exists only to feed the endless machine of imperial production. And then, when you understand what it means to barely survive in such a place, you must imagine something infinitely worse. You must imagine an enemy that sees your entire world not as a conquest, not as a prize to be taken, but as nothing more than food. Imagine an intelligence so vast and alien that it spans galaxies, directing countless billions of bioengineered horrors with a single purpose: to consume everything you are, everything you ever were, and everything you ever could be. This is the reality for those who find themselves on a hive world in the path of a tyrannid hive fleet. This is the slow descent into a nightmare from which there is no awakening, no rescue, and no escape. The tyrannids do not conquer, they do not occupy, they devour, and when they are finished, they leave behind only silence and stone. The Imperium catalogues approximately 32,380 hive worlds across its vast domain, though the actual number fluctuates as worlds are lost to Xenos invasions, warp storms, or simple bureaucratic oversight. Each of these worlds represents a crucial component in the Imperial war machine, producing not just weapons and materials, but the most valuable resource of all: human beings. Billions upon billions of potential soldiers, workers, and servants of the Emperor, all concentrated in massive urban sprawls that can be seen from orbit. When the tyrannids come to such a world, they come to a feast beyond imagining. Every single inhabitant represents biomass to be harvested. Every structure, though made of metal and stone, sits upon foundations of organic waste and accumulated biological matter. The very air in these hive cities, recycled through organic filtration systems and breathing plants, contains nutrients that can be extracted and consumed. A hive world is not just a target for the tyrannids. It is a buffet of such magnitude that entire hive fleets will alter their course to reach it. But before we can understand the consumption, we must understand what is being consumed. We must see the world as it exists before the shadow falls, before the sky fills with spores, before the screaming begins. The world that was Hive Primus stands 73 kilometers tall at its highest spire. From the viewing platforms reserved for the planetary governor and his immediate staff, you can see the curvature of the planet itself, the way the ash wastes stretch to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the distant peaks of other hive cities. The air at this altitude is thin but pure, filtered through 100 levels of atmospheric processes, scented with exotic flowers imported from agri-worlds light years away. But you are not standing on those viewing platforms. Few are. The population of Hive Primus numbers somewhere between 47 and 52 billion souls, and fewer than 10,000 of them will ever breathe air that has not passed through 10,000 other pairs of lungs. First, you work in Manufactorum Delta 779, 12 kilometers below the hive's crown and 18 kilometers above its foundations. Your shift began 14 hours ago and will continue for another 6. The work is simple, repetitive, and absolutely essential. You operate a press that stamps out shell casings for heavy bolter rounds, each one precisely calibrated to imperial specifications that were ancient before your grandfather's grandfather was born. The Manufactorum stretches for kilometers in every direction, a vast chamber carved from the bones of the hive itself. The ceiling disappears into shadows high above, marked only by the occasional flicker of lighting arrays that struggle against the darkness. The floor is a maze of assembly lines, each one tended by hundreds of workers who perform their designated tasks with the mindless efficiency that comes from a lifetime of repetition. The noise is constant, overwhelming, a symphony of industrial fury that makes conversation impossible and renders thought difficult. The clang of metal on metal, the hiss of hydraulics, the grinding of gears, the occasional scream when someone makes a mistake and loses a hand or arm to the machinery. These sounds are the soundtrack of your existence, as familiar as your own heartbeat. The air here is hot and thick with the smell of machine oil, ozone from welding torches, and the peculiar metallic tang of recycled atmosphere that has passed through too many filters without ever seeing the sky. You breathe it without thinking, just as you ignore the ache in your back from standing at your station, the burning in your eyes from staring at the same movement for hours on end, the hunger that gnaws at your belly because the last meal was 8 hours ago and the next is still 4 hours away. This is your life. This is the only life you have ever known, and the only life you will ever know unless injury or age renders you unable to work, at which point you will be recycled like everything else in the hive. Your corpse will be rendered down into corpse starch to feed the next generation of workers, and your bones will be ground into fertilizer for the few remaining food production facilities. Nothing is wasted in a hive city. Nothing can be wasted when billions must be sustained on a world whose surface has long since been rendered uninhabitable by industry. Above you, separated by kilometers of rockcrete and plasteel, the mid-hivers live in relative comfort. They are the administrators, the overseers, the minor nobles who manage the countless systems that keep the hive functioning. They have natural light, piped in through elaborate mirror systems from the surface. They have running water that comes from purification plants rather than condensation collectors. They have food that resembles actual food rather than the grey-brown nutrient paste that sustains the workers below. But even they are nothing compared to those who dwell in the spires, the nobility, the merchant princes, the high-ranking members of the Adeptus Administratum, who coordinate the hive's contribution to the imperial tithe. These privileged few live in a world of luxury that would seem fantastical to someone like you. They have gardens, actual growing things tended by armies of servants. They have windows that look out upon the world beyond the hive. They have access to off-world goods, exotic foods, and entertainments that the masses below can scarcely imagine. And below you, separated by another 18 kilometers of hive structure, lies the underhive. Here, the rule of imperial law has long since broken down, replaced by the brutal hierarchy of gangs and mutant tribes. Here, in the ruins of older construction, in the collapsed sectors and forgotten chambers, humanity reverts to its basest instincts. Here, the weak are prey, and the strong survive only until someone stronger comes along. The population of the underhive is unknown, and probably unknowable. The Adeptus Arbites makes periodic sweeps, culling the numbers when they grow too large, but new inhabitants simply flood in to replace the dead. Some are criminals, fleeing justice in the levels above. Others are simply the unlucky, those who fell through the cracks of imperial society and found themselves in the darkness below. A few are mutants, their genetic corruption making them unwelcome in the higher levels, forced to eke out an existence among the ruins and refuse. This vertical segregation is the natural order of a hive city. Those at the top literally look down upon those below, and those below can only dream of ascending even a single level closer to the light. It is a system that has persisted for thousands of years, across thousands of worlds, brutal in its efficiency and absolute in its enforcement. But it is also a system built on a foundation that assumes the Imperium's protection, that takes for granted the relative stability that comes from being just one more world among millions. It assumes that life will continue as it always has, generation after generation, world without end. That assumption is about to be tested in ways that no one in the hive can possibly imagine. Your shift finally ends, and you make your way through the labyrinthine corridors that connect the manufactorum to your hab block. The journey takes 45 minutes, navigating through passages so crowded that you must sometimes turn sideways to squeeze between the press of bodies. The air grows no fresher as you travel. If anything, it becomes worse, thick with the smell of unwashed humanity and the peculiar sourness of recycled water. Your HAB unit is a cube measuring 3 meters by 3 meters by 2.5 meters high. You share it with your spouse and 2 children. There is a sleeping pallet that folds down from one wall, a small cooking unit that runs on geothermal power tapped from deep within the hive, and a waste reclamation unit that processes everything into fertilizer for the hive's food production systems. There are no windows, of course. Windows are for those who can afford to have something to look at, and you are 18 kilometers above the surface and 12 kilometers below the spire. There is nothing to see but the corridor outside, which looks exactly like every other corridor in this section of the hive. This is home. This is what you fight to return to each day, what you labor to maintain. It is not much, but it is yours, purchased with your sweat and sanctified by the presence of your family. Your children were born here, and if the Emperor wills it, they will work in the same manufactorum you do, stamping out shell casings for bolters that will be fired on worlds they will never see, in wars they will never comprehend. You eat your evening meal, a portion of corpse starch mixed with protein supplement and flavored with a few precious drops of synthetic seasoning. Your spouse has managed to acquire a small addition of textured fungus protein, a rare treat that makes the meal almost palatable. You share it with your children, watching as they eat with the unconscious hunger of youth, and you feel something that might be contentment. Tomorrow will be the same as today. The day after that will be the same as tomorrow. This is the rhythm of life in a hive city, unchanging and eternal. You have your work, your family, your small corner of the Emperor's Imperium. What more could anyone ask for? You do not know that this is the last normal meal you will ever eat. You do not know that within 3 solar days, the very concept of normalcy will be shattered beyond recognition. You do not know that the sky above the hive, hidden from your sight by kilometers of rockcrete and steel, is already beginning to change. The stars are going out, one by one, obscured by something vast and terrible that approaches from the void. The astropaths in their sanctums high in the spire have begun to scream, their minds overwhelmed by a psychic pressure that builds like a coming storm. The navigators who guide ships through the warp have found their vision clouded, the Astronomican's light dimmed by an interference they cannot name or comprehend. And in the underhive, in the deepest and darkest places, where even the gangers fear to tread, things that have lurked in shadow for decades are beginning to stir, responding to a call that echoes across the light years. The Genestealer cults, patient and prepared, feel the approach of their gods and begin their final preparations. The feast is about to begin. The shadow falls. The first sign that something is wrong comes not with violence or obvious threat, but with silence. The Vox systems that connect the hive to the wider world, that carry news from across the sector and beyond, that maintain the constant flow of information necessary for a world of 50 billion souls to function, begin to fail. At first, it is subtle. A delay in receiving the daily, astropathic transmissions from the sector capital, a slight degradation in the signal quality of off-world communications, the kind of thing that might be explained by solar flares or unusual warp currents. But it continues and it worsens. Within 2 days, all astropathic communication has ceased entirely. The messages that do come through are fragmented, incoherent, spoken by astropaths whose minds are clearly fracturing under some unseen pressure. They speak of a darkness in the warp, of something vast and hungry that blots out the light of the Astronomican. They speak of screaming silence and chittering void, of minds that are not minds and thoughts that burn like acid. And then they stop speaking at all. The planetary governor convenes an emergency session of his advisory council, representatives from the Adeptus Administratum, the Planetary Defense Force, the Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests, who maintain the hive's infrastructure, and the local ecclesiarchy gather in the grate. council chamber high in the spire. The air is thick with incense and tension, and for the first time in living memory, there is genuine fear in the eyes of those who rule. The chief astropath, when he is brought before the council, is barely recognizable as human. His eyes weep blood, and his hands shake with a tremor that speaks of neurological damage. When he speaks, his voice is a broken whisper that somehow carries through the chamber. "The stars are screaming," he says. "The warp is drowning in alien thoughts. Billions upon billions of minds, none of them human, all of them hungry. They are coming. Emperor, preserve us. They are coming, and there is nothing we can do to stop them." The governor demands clarification, demands specifics, demands to know what enemy approaches and when it will arrive. But the astropath can provide no useful intelligence. The psychic interference is too great, the shadow in the warp too complete. He knows only that something vast and terrible approaches, something that drowns out all other psychic signals like a scream, drowning out a whisper. And then, as the council debates and argues and struggles to understand what this means, the astropath begins to laugh. It is a horrible sound, broken and wrong, and it continues even as blood runs from his nose and ears. His laughter ends only when his heart stops, the strain of whatever he has experienced proving too much for his enhanced physiology to withstand. In the sanctums where the other astropaths dwell, protected by wards and psychic shields, similar scenes are playing out. Of the 17 astropaths assigned to the hive, 12 die within the first 3 days of the shadow's arrival. The 5 who survive do so only by severing their connection to the warp entirely, rendering themselves useless for their intended purpose, but preserving their sanity and their lives. For the common people of the hive, these events are unknown. You go to work, you come home, you sleep and wake and work again. But there are small changes that begin to accumulate, details that individually mean nothing but collectively paint a picture of something wrong. The daily announcements that play through the hive's public vox systems, usually filled with imperial propaganda and productivity quotas, become shorter and less frequent. The overseers in the manufactorums seem nervous, distracted, and more than usually harsh with those who fail to meet their quotas. There are whispers of supply shipments that have failed to arrive, of warehouses that are beginning to run low on essential materials. And then there are the dreams. You wake in the middle of your sleep cycle, your heart pounding, your mind filled with images that dissolve like smoke when you try to grasp them. You dreamed of hunger, vast and all-consuming, of teeth and claws and endless appetite. You dreamed of the sky falling, of walls melting like wax, of your children screaming as something unseen dragged them into darkness. You tell yourself it was just a nightmare, stress from increased quotas perhaps, or bad protein supplement in your last meal. But when you speak to your spouse, you learn that they too had troubled dreams. And when you arrive at work, you overhear others speaking of similar experiences. The dreams are spreading through the hive like a disease, touching everyone, regardless of their station or position. The tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus have a different perspective on the changes occurring. Their augmetic sensors detect shifts in electromagnetic fields, unusual patterns in the hive's power distribution, subtle variations in the planet's magnetic field that have no natural explanation. Their most sensitive instruments pick up what they describe as background noise in every frequency, a kind of static that should not exist. Some of the more knowledgeable among them recognize the signs. They have read the reports from other worlds, other sectors, other times when the Tyranids came. They know what the shadow in the warp represents, what it means when the stars go silent and the warp becomes thick with alien thought. They make their recommendations to the planetary authorities, urging immediate mobilization of all military forces, evacuation of non-essential personnel, and a request for imperial assistance. But who can they ask? The astropaths are dead or useless. No ship can safely navigate the warp when the shadow falls so heavily. They are alone, cut off from the Imperium that is supposed to protect them, isolated on a world that has become a target for an enemy they cannot yet see. In the spires, the nobility begins to panic. Some make arrangements to flee off-world, bribing void ship captains to take them through the warp, despite the danger. A few succeed, their vessels disappearing into the immaterium and never being heard from again, their fate unknown and unknowable. Most find that the ships they had counted on have already departed, their captains unwilling to risk their vessels and crews for any price. Those who cannot flee begin to fortify. Private armies are expanded, security measures are enhanced, and stockpiles of food and water are secured behind reinforced doors. The wealthy have always known that the masses below might rise up if pushed too far, and now they prepare for that eventuality, even as they remain ignorant of the true threat that approaches. In the Underhive, the gangs feel it too, though they lack the education to understand what they sense. The mutants and the outcasts, those whose altered genetics make them more sensitive to psychic phenomena, huddle in their dens and speak of doom approaching. Some flee deeper into the ruins, seeking shelter in levels so old that they remember when the planet still had a sky that could be seen. Others prepare to fight, not knowing what they will fight or when it will come, only that something is coming and that hiding will not save them. And in the deepest, most forgotten places of the Underhive, in chambers sealed for centuries and forgotten by all but a few, the Genestealer cults gather. They have waited for this moment for generations, ever since the first pure-strain Genestealer found its way into the hive aboard a merchant vessel and began its patient work of infection and reproduction. The cult has grown slowly, carefully, seeding itself throughout the hive's population. The first generation of hybrids were monstrous things, barely able to pass for human, relegated to the darkest corners of the Underhive. But each subsequent generation became more human in appearance, able to move freely through hive society, to take positions of minor authority, to spread the infection further. By now, the cult numbers in the hundreds of thousands spread across all levels of the hive. There are cultists among the factory workers, among the Adeptus Administratum clerks, among the enforcers of the Adeptus Arbites. There are even a few among the nobility, their genetic corruption hidden by wealth and privilege, their true nature known only to their patriarch and the alien will that guides them all. For years they have waited, preparing for the day of ascension, when their gods would come to deliver them from the oppression of the Imperium. They have stockpiled weapons in hidden caches throughout the hive. They have identified key targets, strategic locations that will need to be secured when the time comes. They have infiltrated the PDF and know the positions of every major defensive emplacement. And now, as the shadow in the warp grows stronger, as the psychic call of the hive fleet echoes in their minds like a trumpet blast, they know their time has come. The Patriarch, ancient and massive, its psychic power swollen by decades of growth, sends out the signal that they have all been waiting for. The uprising begins. The enemy within it starts in the manufacturing districts, in the vast complexes where billions labor to produce the materials that feed the imperial war machine. Workers who have seemed normal, even exemplary, suddenly turn on their fellows with a savagery that is both shocking and coordinated. They move with purpose, with unified intent, targeting overseers and enforcers first, then anyone who attempts to resist. You are at your station when it happens, pressing out shell casings with the mindless efficiency of long practice, when the worker 3 stations down from you pulls a makeshift weapon from beneath their workstation and drives it into the overseer's throat. Before you can process what you have seen, before you can even react, 2 more workers rush the secondary overseer, bearing him to the ground with sheer numbers, their hands and improvised weapons rising and falling in a frenzy of violence. The manufactorum erupts into chaos. Some workers flee, running for the exits in blind panic. Others stand frozen, unable to comprehend what they are witnessing. And still others, more than you would, have believed possible, reveal themselves as part of the uprising, producing weapons and moving with coordinated purpose to secure the exits, to disable the Vox systems, to take control of the facility. You run. You do not think, you simply react, fleeing toward the nearest exit. Behind you, you can hear screaming, the sounds of violence and death. You see workers you have labored beside for years transforming before your eyes into something else, their human features twisted by an alien fervor that burns in their eyes like fever. You make it into the corridor beyond the manufactorum, and here the scene is even worse. The uprising is not limited to your facility. It is happening everywhere simultaneously. A coordinated strike timed with precision across thousands of locations throughout the hive. The corridors are choked with people, some fleeing, others fighting, and still others who have revealed their true nature as cultists. And among the cultists, you see things that cannot be, should not be. Figures that are too tall, too thin, their movements fluid and wrong. You catch glimpses of extra limbs, of distended heads, of skin that seems to ripple and shift. These are the earlier generation hybrids, the ones who could not pass for fully human, now freed from their hiding places and eager to participate in the uprising they have dreamed of for so long. You think of your family, your spouse and children in your hab unit kilometers away, and you begin to fight your way through the chaos toward them. The journey that usually takes 45 minutes stretches into hours as you navigate through corridors that have become war zones. Enforcers of the Adeptus Arbites, those who have not already been killed or revealed as cultists themselves, fight desperate holding actions at key choke points, trying to maintain some semblance of order. You see an enforcer cut down by gunfire, his armor unable to withstand the concentrated fire of a dozen cultists armed with stolen lace guns. You see civilians torn apart by hybrid monstrosities that move with terrifying speed and strength. You see things that will haunt your dreams for the rest of your life, however long that may be. By the time you reach your hab block, it has already been overrun. The corridors are filled with the dead, and the walls are marked with strange symbols painted in blood, sigils that hurt to look at, that seem to writhe and shift when you try to focus on them. You find your hab unit, the door torn from its hinges, and inside. Your spouse is dead, killed defending your children. Your youngest child is dead too, their small body broken by violence you cannot bear to examine too closely. Your older child is gone, taken by the cultists, for purposes you dare not imagine. You fall to your knees in the ruins of your home, your hands covered in your spouse's blood, your mind unable to process the magnitude of what has been taken from you. The world has ended. Everything you worked for, everything you cared about, everything that gave your existence meaning, has been destroyed in a matter of hours. And this is only the beginning. Across the hive, similar scenes are playing out in countless hab blocks, manufactorums, and administrative centers. The Genestealer cult has struck with devastating effect, targeting the infrastructure and personnel necessary to mount an effective defense. Power stations are seized or sabotaged. Water purification plants fall under cult control. Communication hubs are destroyed or captured, cutting off different sections of the hive from each other and preventing coordinated response. The Planetary Defense Force attempts to mobilize, but finds itself fighting battles on 1,000 fronts simultaneously. Units deployed to restore order in one district find themselves ambushed from unexpected directions. Officers discover that their subordinates are cultists, turning their weapons on their own comrades. Armored vehicles are disabled by sabotage before they can even leave their motor pools. The PDF commander, a veteran of numerous campaigns against orcs and chaos cultists, has never faced an enemy like this. The cultists do not fight like normal insurgents. They show no fear of death, advancing into gunfire with a fanatical zeal that is unnerving even to experienced soldiers. They coordinate their actions with impossible precision, as if guided by a single will, and they seem to know the positions of PDF forces before those forces even arrive. What the commander does not know, what he cannot know, is that the cultists are indeed guided by a single will. The brood mind, the psychic gestalt that connects all members of the cult through their patriarch, allows them to function as a single organism with billions of hands. They share information instantaneously, coordinate their actions without need for vox communication, and adapt to changing tactical situations with inhuman speed. High in the spires, the governor finally accepts the truth that his advisors have been trying to make him understand. This is not a simple uprising of discontented workers. This is not even a chaos cult rebellion like those that have plagued other worlds. This is something far worse, a Xenos infiltration that has compromised the hive from top to bottom, and it is only the prelude to something even more terrible. He orders the activation of the hive's void shields, massive energy barriers designed to protect against orbital bombardment. He commands the PDF to implement martial law with extreme prejudice, authorizing the use of any force necessary to put down the uprising. He sends desperate pleas for help through every remaining communication channel, knowing they will likely go unanswered, but hoping against hope that someone will hear. And he prays. The governor is not a particularly religious man, his faith more a matter of political necessity than true belief. But now he prays with a fervor he has never felt before. He prays that the emperor will protect his people, that the Adeptus Astartes will arrive to deliver them from this nightmare, that somehow, some way, they will survive what is coming. His prayers, like those of billions of others across the hive, go unanswered. The emperor protects, the faithful say, but on this day, on this world, protection is not forthcoming. You emerge from your destroyed home, moving like a ghost through corridors that have become a charnel house. You have no destination, no plan, no purpose beyond the animal need to survive. Around you, the battle between PDF forces and cultists continues to rage, but you barely notice. You are beyond fear now, beyond horror, existing in a state of shock that shields you from the full weight of what you have experienced. You join a stream of refugees fleeing upward, seeking the imagined safety of the mid-hive levels. Thousands make the same journey, a great migration of humanity, fleeing from the violence below, hoping that the authorities above will provide protection, sustenance, salvation. But the mid-hive is little better. The uprising has not been limited to the manufactorum levels. Cultists have revealed themselves here too, and the fighting is just as fierce. The difference is that here, the PDF has managed to establish some defensible positions, creating fortified zones where non-infected civilians can shelter. You are processed by exhausted enforcers who check you for signs of infection, looking for the telltale marks of genetic corruption. You pass their inspection, more by luck than anything else, and are directed to a refugee center in a converted warehouse. The space is already overcrowded, thousands of people packed into a facility designed for hundreds. But you are grateful simply to be somewhere that offers the illusion of safety. Here, you learn the full scale of the catastrophe. The refugees share stories, each one more terrible than the last. Entire hab blocks have been taken over by the armiseurs, cultists. Manufacturing districts that employed millions have gone silent. And there are rumors, whispered in horrified tones, of things emerging from the underhive, creatures that are neither fully human nor fully xenos, monstrosities that hunt through the darkened corridors with supernatural speed and ferocity. An old woman tells you that she saw pure strains, actual genestealers, tall and terrible with 4 clawed arms and eyeless faces that somehow see everything. A manufactorum worker swears he saw a patriarch, a thing 3 meters tall and swollen with psychic power, its presence alone enough to drive men mad with fear. A former enforcer speaks of hybrids of every generation, from those who look almost human to things that should not exist, all of them working together with unified purpose. And then someone asks the question that everyone has been avoiding. Why? Why would these cultists, many of them born in the hive, many of them with families and lives just like everyone else, turn against their own kind with such violence? What could possibly motivate such complete betrayal? A man in the robes of a minor ecclesiarchy priest provides the answer, his voice hollow with despair. The cultists, he explains, worship the Tyranids as gods. They believe the Hive fleet is coming to save them, to elevate them, to grant them ascension into something greater than mere humanity. They have been preparing for this moment for generations, and they genuinely believe that when the Tyranids arrive, they will be rewarded for their faithful service. The reality, the priest continues, is far darker. The Tyranids do not reward. They do not spare. They consume everything, including those who worship them. The cultists are tools, nothing more, used to weaken the Hive's defenses and make the eventual consumption easier. When the Tyranids come, the cultists will die just like everyone else, their biomass harvested and repurposed like all the other organic matter on the world. This knowledge that the cultists are not only traitors, but fools who doom themselves along with everyone else, somehow makes it worse. There is no rationality to it, no logic that can be understood or negotiated with. It is simply madness, wrapped in religious fervor and directed toward an ending that can only mean death for all. You spend 3 days in the refugee center, 3 days during which the fighting continues to rage throughout the Hive. The PDF makes some progress, retaking key districts and establishing secure perimeters, but the cost is staggering. Thousands of soldiers die in brutal close-quarters combat. Millions of civilians are caught in the crossfire or fall victim to the cultists' knives. And then, on the 4th day, everything changes. The Vox systems, silent for days, suddenly crackle to life with a message from the Hive's Defensive Operations Center. All citizens are to seek shelter immediately. All windows, where they exist, are to be shuttered. All non-essential personnel are to vacate the upper levels and move to hardened shelters in the mid-Hive. You do not understand why. Not at first. But then you hear it. A sound that filters down through kilometers of rockcrete and steel. A sound that should not be possible to hear through such barriers. It is a sound like thunder, like the world itself groaning under impossible weight, like the sky screaming. The Tyranids have arrived. The sky burns. The first mycetic spores hit the Hive's upper atmosphere, traveling at speeds that turn them into meteors, their organic hulls burning with friction heat as they plunge toward the surface. They are not elegant or subtle. They are kinetic bombardment, disguised as biological invasion, massive pods of living tissue designed to survive atmospheric entry and deliver their cargo intact to the ground below. The Hive's void shields, designed to protect against orbital bombardment, prove woefully inadequate against this assault. The shields were built to stop energy, weapons, and explosive ordnance, not living projectiles that can adapt their trajectory mid-flight, that can sense the gaps in the defensive network and exploit them with unnatural precision. The first wave consists of hundreds of spores, each one the size of a transport vehicle, each one containing either smaller organisms ready to spread throughout the Hive or specialized bioforms designed to assess the defenses and identify weaknesses. They slam into the upper levels of the Hive, into the spires where the nobility live, and the destruction is immediate and catastrophic. You feel the impacts even kilometers below, great shuddering jolts that make the entire structure shake, that send cracks racing through walls and ceilings. The lights flicker and fail as power conduits are severed. Emergency lighting kicks in, bathing everything in a hellish red glow that seems appropriate for what is unfolding. The second wave is larger, thousands of spores falling like rain across the Hive and the surrounding ash wastes. These ones carry the vanguard organisms, the Tyranid creatures designed to spread terror and begin the work of destabilizing the planet's biosphere. Lictors, tall and terrible, with chameleonic skin and killing claws. Gargoyles, winged horrors that fill the sky with their screeching cries. Hormagaunts, scuttling nightmare creatures that move with insectile speed and attack with mindless ferocity. But it is what the spores release into the atmosphere that is truly terrible. Microscopic organisms, billions upon billions of them, designed to begin the process of transforming the planet into something more suitable for tyrannid consumption. They are xenophagic viruses and bacteria, designer organisms that can survive in almost any environment and reproduce at frightening speed. These microscopic invaders have multiple purposes. Some attack the planet's native plant life, wherever such things still exist, altering their genetic structure to make them grow faster, larger, drawing nutrients from deep in the soil and concentrating them in easily harvested biomass. Others begin to change the atmospheric composition, breaking down complex molecules and releasing compounds that will eventually make the air unbreathable for humans, but perfect for tyrannid organisms. Still others are designed to attack animal life directly, including humans. They enter through the lungs with every breath, multiply in the bloodstream, and begin to break down cellular walls. The effects are not immediate, but within days, those exposed will begin to experience hemorrhaging, organ failure, and a slow, agonizing death as their bodies are literally dissolved from within. The hive's defensive batteries, massive laser cannons, and missile arrays, positioned on the upper levels, open fire at the descending spores with everything they have. The sky becomes a light show of lasfire and exploding ordnance, and many spores are destroyed before they can reach the surface. But there are too many. For every spore that is shot down, 5 more make it through, and each one that survives releases its cargo into the hive. In the refugee center where you have taken shelter, panic spreads as the structure shudders from repeated impacts. The ceiling cracks, and you can see daylight through the breach, actual sunlight that you have not seen since childhood, filtered through a sky that has turned the sickly purple-green of tyrannid corruption. An enforcer tries to maintain order, shouting that everyone must remain calm, that the PDF has the situation under control, that reinforcements are coming. But his voice is lost in the screaming, and when part of the ceiling collapses, crushing dozens of refugees beneath tons of falling debris, what little order remained breaks down completely. You flee with the crowd, a stampede of terrified humanity pouring into the corridors beyond. You have no destination, no plan. You simply run because running feels like the only thing you can do. Around you, others do the same, and the corridors become choked with people pushing and shoving and trampling those who fall. You emerge into a larger chamber, some kind of cargo transfer station, and here you see your first tyrannid. It is a hormigaunt, standing 3 meters tall on reverse-jointed legs, its body a nightmare fusion of insect and reptile and something else entirely alien. Its head is eyeless, but somehow it sees you, turning in your direction with predatory focus. Its scything claws, each one longer than your forearm, gleam with some kind of organic secretion that steams in the air. The hormigaunt screams, a sound that is not quite animal and not quite anything else, and charges. It covers the distance between you in heartbeats, moving with a speed that seems impossible for something its size. You throw yourself to the side, more by instinct than plan, and the creature's claws miss you by centimeters, close enough that you feel the wind of their passage. The refugees behind you are not so lucky. The hormigaunt crashes into the crowd like a scythe through wheat, its claws rising and falling in a frenzy of killing. Blood sprays in arcs across the walls. Screams fill the air, and still more refugees pour into the chamber, fleeing from other horrors in other corridors, running straight into the killing zone. You scramble to your feet and run, not looking back, not thinking, just running. Behind you, the screaming continues, joined by more alien shrieks as additional hormigaunts enter the chamber. You can hear the wet sounds of tearing flesh, the crack of breaking bones, the gurgling cries of the dying. You find yourself in a maintenance shaft, some kind of access tunnel for the hive's infrastructure. It is cramped and dark, but it leads away from the killing, and right now, that is all that matters. You crawl through the tunnel, your hands and knees scraping on metal grating. your breath coming in ragged gasps. The tunnel opens into a service bay, and here you find other survivors, perhaps 20 people huddled in the darkness, trying to stay quiet, trying to stay hidden. They have barricaded the entrances with whatever they could find, creating crude fortifications from cargo containers and industrial equipment. An older man, his uniform marking him as some kind of mid-level administrator, takes charge with the kind of authority that comes from a lifetime of managing others. He organizes watch rotations, inventories the meager supplies they have, and tries to establish some kind of plan for survival. But even as he works, you can see the fear in his eyes, the knowledge that this sanctuary is temporary at best. You spend the rest of that day in the service bay, listening to the sounds of battle echoing through the hive's infrastructure. There are explosions, distant but powerful enough to make the walls shake. There is gunfire, the distinctive crack of laser guns, and the heavier roar of bolters. There are screams, human and alien both, a constant background noise that never quite stops. As night falls, not that you can see the difference in the darkness of the service bay, the sounds change. The gunfire becomes less frequent, the explosions more sporadic. But the alien sounds grow louder, closer. You can hear things moving through the corridors beyond your barricades, things that scratch at the walls and test the barriers with inhuman patience. The old administrator tries to keep everyone calm, but his authority is fragile, held together only by the shared need for organization in the face of chaos. When one of the survivors, a young woman barely out of adolescence, begins to sob uncontrollably, he tries to comfort her, but his platitudes ring hollow. What comfort can be offered when the world is ending? You try to sleep, but it is impossible. Every sound makes you jump. Every shadow seems to move with malevolent purpose. You find yourself thinking about your family, about your spouse and children. Dead, now, and perhaps lucky for it. At least their suffering is over. You are still here, still trapped in this nightmare, and you have no idea how long you can endure it. The second day brings a new horror. The atmospheric contamination has begun to take effect. Those who breathed the spore-laden air during the initial bombardment start to show symptoms. It begins with coughing, a wet, hacking sound that brings up blood. Then comes the fever, burning through bodies already weakened by stress and lack of food. Finally, the hemorrhaging begins, blood weeping from every orifice as cellular structure breaks down. In the confined space of the service bay, disease spreads quickly. The administrator tries to quarantine the sick, but there is nowhere to put them, no way to separate them from the healthy. Within hours, half your group is showing symptoms. Within a day, most of them are dead, their bodies piled in a corner because there is nowhere else to put them. You are one of the lucky ones, if such a term has any meaning anymore. You show no symptoms, your exposure to the contamination apparently minimal. But you watch others die in agony, and you know that your immunity is likely temporary. Sooner or later, the spores will find you too. Throughout the hive, this scene is repeated countless times. Millions die from the atmospheric contamination alone, their bodies dissolving from within, their deaths agonizing and inevitable. The PDF tries to distribute respirators and sealed environment suits, but there are not nearly enough to go around, and many of those they do have malfunction or are damaged in the fighting. The tyrannid organisms, meanwhile, are establishing themselves throughout the hive. Lictors stalk the corridors, their chameleonic skin making them nearly invisible, their feeder tendrils seeking out any humans they can find to drain of knowledge and nutrients. Gargoyles nest in the upper levels, using the hive's spires as roosts from which to launch attacks on PDF positions. And the hormagaunts, those mindless killing machines, sweep through the hive in vast swarms, overwhelming defensive positions through sheer numbers. The PDF soldiers fight bravely, their laser guns cutting down dozens of the creatures, but for every hormagaunt killed, 2 more seem to take its place. The third day brings the arrival of the larger bioforms, carnifexes, Massive armored creatures that serve as living tanks smash through the hive's walls as if they were paper. Warriors, tall and terrible, direct the smaller organisms with cold intelligence, their minds linked to the hive mind and serving as synaptic nodes that coordinate the attack. And with these larger creatures come the real terror. The PDF's heavy weapons, plasma cannons and lascannons that could destroy armored vehicles, prove only partially effective against tyrannid bioforms that can adapt and evolve in real time. A weapon that kills carnifexes one day finds the creatures resistant to it the next. There, carapaces having thickened or altered to deflect the specific type of damage. The governor, still barricaded in his palace high in the main spire, receives reports of the carnage unfolding below. Entire districts have gone silent. Millions are dead or missing. The PDF is fighting desperate holding actions, but losing ground with every hour. And worst of all, the Genestealer cults, which had seemed to go quiet after the initial uprising, are now active again, attacking PDF positions from behind, sabotaging defenses, and generally making coordinated resistance impossible. He makes the decision that no planetary governor ever wants to make. He sends out a final message on all remaining channels, a message that he knows will likely never be received by anyone who could help. The message is simple. The hive world is under tyrannid attack, defenses are failing, immediate military assistance is required, or all will be lost. The message repeats on an endless loop, broadcast into the void on the Fae. Slim hope that some passing vessel might receive it, that some Imperial Navy patrol might be close enough to intervene. But in his heart, the governor knows the truth. They are alone. The shadow in the warp blocks all astropathic communication. Even if a rescue force was dispatched immediately, it would take weeks to arrive, and they do not have weeks. They probably do not even have days. The desperate defense. In the command bunker deep beneath the primary hive, Marshal Tyron of the Planetary Defense Force stares at tactical displays that tell a story of mounting catastrophe. The hololithic projections show the hive in cross-section, and nearly a third of it is highlighted in red, indicating areas that have fallen to the Tyrannid advance or are no longer in contact with command. Marshal Tyron is a career soldier, a man who has spent 40 years in the PDF, rising through the ranks through a combination of competence and political acumen. He has fought orcs, put down chaos cult, uprisings, and defended against Dark Elder raids. But he has never faced an enemy like this. The Tyrannids do not follow conventional military doctrine. They do not have supply lines to cut or command structures to decapitate. They do not retreat when faced with superior firepower, and they do not require rest or resupply. They simply advance, constantly and relentlessly, adapting to whatever resistance they encounter, and overwhelming it through a combination of numbers, adaptability, and sheer biological horror. His forces, once numbering in the millions, have been reduced by half in the first 3 days of fighting. Some casualties are from combat, cut down by tyrannid claws, or dissolved by the bioweapons that many of the larger organisms carry. Others are from desertion, soldiers who threw down their weapons and fled when faced with horrors their training had never prepared them for. And then there are the cultists, the Genestealer cult. Uprising cost him tens of thousands of troops in the initial chaos, and now those same cultists are fighting alongside the Tyrannids, their knowledge of the hive's layout and defenses making them devastatingly effective as guides and saboteurs. He has had to implement brutal security measures, executing suspected cultists on sight, but he knows that more lurk hidden among his own forces, waiting for the moment to strike. His communication systems crackle with reports from across the hive, each one worse than the last. A company of PDF troopers holding the central processing plant has been overrun by a wave of Hormagaunts, estimated at 10,000 strong. The defensive batteries in the northern spire have gone silent, their crews likely dead or fled. A Carnifex has broken through into the mid-hive levels and is currently rampaging through residential districts, killing everything in its path. Marshal Tyren, makes his decisions with the cold efficiency of long experience. He orders a tactical retreat from untenable positions, consolidating his forces into defensible strongpoints. He authorizes the use of the Hive's stockpile of promethium for mass firebombing operations, knowing that such weapons will kill civilians along with Tyranids, but seeing no alternative. He requests that all remaining reserves be mobilized, including the barely trained conscripts who were recruited from the refugee centers. But he knows, even as he gives these orders, that they are buying time at best. The Tyranids are not being defeated. They are barely being slowed. Without reinforcements, without support from off-world, the Hive will fall. It is not a question of if, but when. In the mid-Hive levels, PDF Sergeant Kavos leads what remains of her platoon through corridors that have become a war zone. They are down to 22 soldiers from an original strength of 50, and every one of them shows the strain of 3 days of constant combat. Their uniforms are torn and blood-stained, their eyes are hollow with exhaustion and trauma. Their hands shake when they reload their laser guns, but they are still fighting, still trying to hold the line, still attempting to create safe zones where civilians can shelter. Kavos is proud of them, even as she knows that their efforts are probably futile. They are moving through what was once a commercial district, shops and small businesses that catered to the mid-Hive's middle class. Now, it is a ruin. The shops have been looted or destroyed. Bodies lie everywhere, civilians who were caught in the crossfire or targeted by cultist attacks. The air is thick with smoke from fires that burn unchecked, and the distinctive smell of death is everywhere. Kavos's Vox unit crackles with a report from the scout she sent ahead. He has found a group of civilians barricaded in a warehouse, perhaps 200 of them, but there are Tyranids nearby, a pack of hormagaunts that seems to be hunting through the district methodically. The civilians need evacuation, but attempting it will draw the hormagaunts' attention. She makes the decision without hesitation. They will extract the civilians. It is what they are here for, what they have sworn to do. She orders her platoon into defensive positions, setting up overlapping fields of fire, placing her heavy weapon team in a position where they can provide covering fire. The evacuation begins, civilians streaming out of the warehouse and moving toward a safer location several hundred meters away. Everything goes smoothly for the first few minutes. Then, the hormagaunts arrive. They come around the corner in a wave of chitin and claws, moving faster than seems possible, their eyeless faces somehow tracking the humans with perfect precision. Kavos's platoon opens fire, laser guns cutting through the air in precise volleys. The first rank of hormagaunts goes down, their bodies smoking from las burns, but the ones behind simply leap over their fallen kin and continue the charge. The heavy weapon team fires its autocannon, the heavy shells tearing massive holes in the Tyranid ranks. But there are so many of them, more than Kavos has ever seen in one place. She realizes with sickening certainty that this is not a hunting pack. This is a proper swarm, and her platoon has walked into the middle of it. She orders a fighting retreat, her soldiers falling back by squads while maintaining fire discipline. But the hormagaunts are faster, and they are flanking, cutting off the escape route. Kavos sees one of her troopers go down, dragged into the mass of aliens and torn apart in seconds. Then another falls, and another. The civilians are screaming, running in panic, and the hormagaunts follow, their killing instincts driving them toward the easiest prey. Kavos makes a decision that will haunt her for the rest of her life, however long that may be. She orders her remaining soldiers to focus their fire on the hormagaunts pursuing the civilians, effectively using her own troops as bait to buy the civilians time to escape. It works, but the cost is terrible. Her platoon is reduced to 7 soldiers by the time the last civilian makes it to safety. 7 out of the 50 who started this mission, out of the hundreds who were in her company when the invasion began. She leads her survivors into a fortified position, a strong point that the PDF has established in what was once a transit hub. Here, she finds other units in similar condition, remnants of platoons and companies that have been ground down by constant combat. The overall commander, a major she does not recognize, is trying to organize some kind of coordinated defense. but it is clear that he is overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. That night, Kavos and her remaining soldiers huddle in a storage room, trying to rest while they can. They speak little, each lost in their own thoughts, their own memories of comrades lost. One of her troopers, a young man who cannot be more than 18, breaks down crying, and Kavos lets him. There is no point in maintaining discipline when the world is ending. In the lower hive, where the fighting has been fiercest, entire districts have been abandoned by the PDF. The soldiers simply do not have the numbers to defend everything, and they have been forced to make brutal decisions about what can be held and what must be sacrificed. Those civilians left behind in these zones face a choice between staying put and hoping to hide from the Tyranids, or trying to flee upward to areas still under PDF control. Most choose to flee, joining the great waves of refugees that clog the hive's arterial corridors, slowing to a crawl the already difficult movement of military forces and supplies. Among these refugees, you continue to survive through a combination of luck and desperate determination. You have joined a group of perhaps 50 people, all of whom have similar stories of loss and trauma. You move together, reasoning that there is safety in numbers, though whether this is actually true remains to be seen. Your group is led by a former ganger from the underhive, a woman named Selka, who knows the hive's hidden ways, the maintenance shafts and forgotten passages that most citizens do not even know exist. She guides you through routes that avoid both the Tyranid swarms and the PDF checkpoints, the latter because she does not trust the military to protect refugees when their own survival is in doubt. You traverse sections of the hive you have never seen before, moving through industrial zones and storage facilities, through collapsed sections where you must climb over rubble, through chambers filled with machinery whose purpose you cannot even guess. And everywhere you go, you see evidence of the catastrophe unfolding. Bodies, both human and Tyranid. Damage to the hive's structure, cracks and holes that were never there before, and the smell, the pervasive stench of death and decay that grows stronger with every hour. On the 5th day, your group encounters something that changes everything. You are moving through an old cargo bay when you hear sounds of combat ahead. Selka signals for everyone to stop, to stay quiet, and she moves forward to investigate. She returns minutes later, her face pale. Ahead, she reports, there is a PDF unit engaged in combat with Tyranids. But they are not alone. With them, fighting alongside the human soldiers, are Space Marines. This news spreads through your group like electricity. The Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's Angels of Death, have arrived. Perhaps there is hope after all. Perhaps they can turn the tide, drive back the Tyranid invasion, save what remains of the hive. You move forward cautiously, and through the gaps in the cargo containers, you see them. They are massive, each one standing over 2 meters tall in their power armor, moving with a grace that seems impossible for such large figures. Their armor is painted in blue and white, marked with icons and honors that speak of countless battles and ancient victories. You recognize them from propaganda posters and imperial doctrine lessons. Ultramarines, the exemplars of the Adeptus Astartes, sons of the Primarch Reboot Guilliman himself. There are perhaps 20 of them, a single squad, and they are systematically annihilating the Tyranid forces arrayed against them. Their bolters speak with a distinctive crack boom, each shot placing a mass reactive shell precisely where it will do the most damage. When the Tyranids close to melee range, the Space Marines meet them with chainswords and power weapons, cutting through chitin armor as if it were paper. You watch a Carnifex, one of the massive armored creatures that you have seen smash through rockcrete walls, charge a Space Marine. The Marine does not retreat or even seem concerned. He plants his feet, raises his bolter, and puts 3 shots into the creature's head at point-blank range. The Carnifex's head explodes in a shower of gore, and the massive body crashes to the ground at the Marine's feet. He steps over it without pausing and continues firing at the next target. The battle lasts perhaps 10 minutes from start to finish, and when it is over, Dozens of Tyranid corpses litter the cargo bay. Not a single space marine has fallen. They begin to reload their weapons with mechanical efficiency, and their squad sergeant notices your group watching from behind the cargo containers. He approaches, and up close, he is even more intimidating. His armor is scarred from countless battles, his helmet displaying a stern death's head insignia. When he speaks, his voice is amplified by his armor's vox systems, resonating with authority. He identifies himself as Sergeant Marius of the Ultramarines 3rd Company. His squad was deployed to the Hive when the invasion began, part of a larger force that is attempting to evacuate key personnel and establish defensive strongpoints. He informs you that there is an evacuation zone being set up in the upper mid-hive, that civilian refugees are being gathered there for potential off-world evacuation. He provides specific coordinates and directions, then warns that time is short. The Tyranids are advancing faster than anticipated, and the window for evacuation is narrowing rapidly. His squad must continue their mission, but he advises you to reach the evacuation zone as quickly as possible. With that, the Space Marines are gone, moving with purpose toward their next objective. You are left staring after them, struck by the contrast between their power and confidence and your own helplessness. But Sergeant Marius's words have given you something you had lost: purpose. There is an evacuation zone. There is a chance, however slim, of getting off this doomed world. Selka immediately begins planning the route to reach the coordinates the Space Marine provided. It will require moving back upward, traversing some of the most dangerous sections of the Hive, areas where Tyranid presence is likely to be heavy. But what choice do you have? Staying here means certain death. At least if you try to reach the evacuation zone, you have a chance. Your group sets out immediately, moving as quickly as they dare through the Hive's labyrinthine passages. You see more signs of the Space Marine presence, areas where defensive positions have been established, where Tyranid corpses are piled like cordwood. But you also see evidence that even the Adeptus Astartes cannot be everywhere. There are sections where the Tyranids have broken through, where civilian bodies lie testament to the failure of protection. As you climb higher into the Hive, the nature of the destruction changes. Here, in the mid-Hive levels, the damage is from more than just combat. The atmospheric contamination has taken a severe toll. You pass entire residential blocks where everyone died from the spore-borne plague, their bodies lying in their homes or collapsed in the corridors, blood leaking from every orifice. You also begin to see signs of something else, something that fills you with a different kind of horror. The Tyranids are not just killing, they are changing things, transforming the environment to suit their needs. You see walls that have been covered in some kind of organic growth, purple-green and pulsing with unnatural life. You see chambers where the floor has been torn up and strange, fleshy structures have been planted, already beginning to grow into something larger. These are the capillary towers in their earliest stages, though you do not know it yet. You do not understand that these strange growths are designed to eventually reach the surface, to connect with the Hive ships in orbit, and pump the planet's biomass upward to be consumed and recycled. All you know is that the sight of them fills you with instinctive revulsion, with the knowledge that they are wrong, alien, an infection spreading through the Hive like a cancer. On the 7th day of the invasion, you finally reach the evacuation zone. It is a massive chamber, some kind of former commercial center that has been converted into a staging area. PDF soldiers man barricades around the perimeter, and you can see several Space Marines coordinating the operation, their presence both reassuring and unsettling. There are thousands of civilians already here, perhaps tens of thousands, all waiting for transport off-world. But as you join the crowd, as you find a space to sit and rest for the first time in days, you hear the conversations around you, and your fragile hope begins to crumble. There are not enough ships. The number of vessels available for evacuation is woefully inadequate for the millions who still survive in the Hive. At best, perhaps 10% of those who make it to the evacuation zone will actually be able to leave. The rest will be left behind, when the Tyranids break through the defenses. The selection process, you learn, is being managed by the Space Marines and senior PDF officers. They are prioritizing based on usefulness to the Imperium. Those with critical skills, those with genetic markers indicating compatibility for Space Marine recruitment, those from noble families who might have political value, they will be saved. The rest, the common workers and refugees who have no particular value beyond their existence, will likely be abandoned. You realize with sick certainty that you fall into that second category. You were a manufactorum worker, replaceable, one of billions doing the same job on thousands of worlds. There is no reason to save you. There is no reason to give you a place on one of those precious ships. And yet, what else can you do but wait? Perhaps there will be more ships than expected. Perhaps the selection criteria will change. Perhaps through some miracle, you will be chosen. So you wait, along with thousands of others, hoping against hope for salvation that will probably never come. Meanwhile, the battle for the Hive continues to rage. The collapse of civilization by the 10th day of the invasion, the pretense of organized resistance has largely collapsed. The PDF still fights in scattered pockets, and the Space Marines continue their operations. But the Hive as a whole has descended into chaos. The thin veneer of imperial civilization has been stripped away, revealing the savage desperation beneath. In the lower Hive levels, those areas not yet overrun by the Tyranids have devolved into anarchy. With no authority to enforce order, with no expectation of rescue or survival, humanity has reverted to its most base instincts. Gangs fight over dwindling supplies of food and water. Strong prey upon the weak. The old social hierarchies have inverted, with those who were once respected now targets for violence and theft. You hear stories from new arrivals at the evacuation zone, tales of horror that have nothing to do with the Tyranids. A refugee camp in the lower levels that descended into cannibalism when food ran out. A water reclamation plant where workers murdered each other for control of the last clean water. A noble family's palatial hab complex that was stormed by a mob. The nobility torn apart by hands hungry for revenge against years of oppression. These stories should shock you, should horrify you, but instead you feel a strange numbness. After everything you have witnessed, after all you have lost, the revelation that humans can be as monstrous as aliens feels almost expected. Civilization, it turns out, is a fragile thing, dependent on the continuity of basic services and the promise of future stability. When both are removed, when survival becomes the only imperative, the beast within emerges. The atmospheric contamination continues to worsen. The initial wave of spore-borne plague killed millions in the first days. Now, those who survived that plague face new horrors as the planet's biosphere begins to transform. The air is becoming difficult to breathe, thick with spores and chemical compounds that make every breath burn. Those without respirators or environmental suits begin to show symptoms of oxygen deprivation, their lips turning blue, their thinking becoming sluggish. The water supply, always a critical concern in a hive city, has become actively dangerous in many districts. The Tyranid organisms have infiltrated the water reclamation plants, and the fluid that comes from the taps is now contaminated with biological agents that accelerate cellular breakdown. Those desperate enough to drink it anyway find themselves dying in agony within hours, their bodies literally dissolving from the inside out. Food becomes the most precious commodity, more valuable than gold or weapons. The hive's vast storage facilities are running low, their stocks depleted by the disruption of normal distribution and the enormous number of refugees concentrated in smaller and smaller areas. Fights break out over scraps of corpse starch. People kill each other for a single nutrition bar. In the evacuation zone, the Space Marines impose strict rationing, their authority absolute and their methods brutal. Those caught stealing food are executed on the spot, their bodies added to the growing pile of casualties. It is harsh, perhaps unnecessarily so, but it maintains a bare minimum of order in a situation that constantly threatens to spiral into complete chaos. You receive your daily ration, a portion of grey paste that tastes of nothing and everything, and you eat it mechanically, no longer capable of feeling hunger or satisfaction, merely consuming because your body requires it. Around you, others do the same, each lost in their own private hells, each trying to hold on to some fragment of hope or purpose. In the upper levels of the hive, in the spires where the wealthy once lived in luxury, the situation is different but no less terrible. Here, the Tyranids have established what imperial observers would call digestion zones, areas where the process of biomass collection has begun in earnest. The Kasson, beautiful gardens, those carefully maintained pockets of greenery that were a symbol of the nobility's status, have been transformed into nightmares. The plants have been infected by Tyranid spores and now grow with terrible speed, their roots digging deep into the hive's foundations, their leaves and fruits swollen with nutrients extracted from the rock itself. But these are no longer plants in any recognizable sense. They are hybrid organisms, part earth flora and part alien biology, and they exist only to be harvested and consumed. Ripper swarms have begun to appear in significant numbers. These are small, maggot-like creatures that exist for one purpose: to consume biomass and return it to the reclamation pools that have begun to form throughout the hive. They flow through the corridors like living carpets, devouring everything organic in their path, from bodies to food stores to the very rats and vermin that once infested the underhive. The Rippers are not intelligent, not individually, but they are directed by the hive mind, their movements coordinated with inhuman precision. They sweep through a district systematically, missing nothing, consuming everything, and once they have gorged themselves on biomass, once their bodies are bloated to the point of immobility, they crawl to the nearest reclamation pool and throw themselves in, adding their own substance to the nutrient-rich gruel that will eventually be pumped into the hive ships above. The reclamation pools are perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the Tyranid consumption process. They start as small puddles of caustic fluid, appearing in places where Tyranid organisms have vomited up pre-digested matter, but they grow quickly, fed by a constant stream of biomass both living and dead. You see one from a distance, peering through the smoked glass of an observation window in the evacuation zone. It is enormous, filling what was once a cargo bay with viscous purple-green liquid that steams and bubbles like acid. Things move in it, partially dissolved forms that might have been human or Tyranid or something else entirely. And at the edges of the pool, you can see Rippers crawling in, their mission complete, their bodies fuel for the greater hunger. From the center of the pool, a structure is beginning to grow. It is called a capillary tower, though you do not know this, a living pipeline that will eventually reach through the hive's structure all the way to the surface and beyond, connecting to the hive ships in orbit. The tower is still small, perhaps 10 meters tall, but it grows visibly, adding height with every hour that passes. The sight fills you with a deep, existential horror. This is what awaits your world. Not mere destruction, but consumption. Every living thing, every biological component, every molecule of organic matter will be broken down and absorbed. The Tyranids will strip the planet of its biosphere, its atmosphere, its oceans, leaving behind only a barren, rock devoid of anything that could support life. And you, if you cannot escape, will be part of that process. Your body will be consumed by Rippers or dissolved in a reclamation pool. Your biomass will be pumped into a hive ship and used to create new Tyranid organisms that will go on to consume other worlds. You will become part of the enemy, your very substance repurposed for the destruction of your own species. This knowledge, this understanding of your true situation, breaks something inside you. You have already lost your family, your home, your identity as a productive member of imperial society. But this is different. This is the loss of meaning itself, the revelation that your entire existence everything you have ever done or been amounts to nothing more than fuel for an alien appetite. You sink to the floor of the evacuation zone, your back against a cargo container, and you begin to laugh. It is not a pleasant sound, more like sobbing than genuine mirth, but you cannot stop. Others look at you with concern or disdain, but you do not care. Let them think you mad. Perhaps you are. Perhaps madness is the only rational response to a situation like this. On the 14th day, the Tyranid assault on the evacuation zone begins. It starts with the power failing, the lights going out across the vast chamber, plunging thousands of refugees into darkness, broken only by emergency lighting and the occasional glow of a lumen strip. Then comes the sound, a scratching and scrabbling in the walls, in the ceiling, in the floor beneath your feet. The Space Marines react immediately, their enhanced senses having detected the approach of the enemy long before normal humans could. They begin organizing the PDF soldiers into defensive positions, establishing kill zones and overlapping fields of fire. But you can see the tension in their movements, the way they check and recheck their weapons, and you understand that even they are concerned about what is coming. The first breach occurs in the eastern wall, a section of rockcrete that simply explodes inward as a carnifex crashes through it. The massive creature is followed by a tide of smaller organisms, hormagaunts and termagants pouring through the gap like water through a broken dam. The PDF opens fire immediately, thousands of laser guns creating a wall of energy that cuts down the first wave of attackers. But there are more behind them, always more, and the breach continues to widen as additional carnifexes hammer at the walls. A Space Marine Devastator squad, their heavy weapons positioned on an elevated platform, opens fire with their lascannons. The powerful energy beams punch through carnifex armor, dropping the massive creatures one after another. But for every one that falls, another appears to take its place. The civilians in the evacuation zone begin to panic. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. You are trapped in this chamber with thousands of others, and the Tyranids are coming. The press of bodies becomes dangerous as people surge away from the fighting, crushing those who fall, trampling children and the weak. You are caught in the crowd, lifted off your feet by the pressure of bodies around you. You fight to breathe, to maintain some space, but it is impossible. You are going to die here, you realize, not from Tyranid claws, but from being crushed by your fellow humans. Then a voice cuts through the chaos, amplified by power armor Vox systems, impossible to ignore. Civilians, hold your positions. Do not panic. The Emperor protects. It is Sergeant Marius, the Ultramarine you encountered days ago. He stands in the center of the chamber, his blue armor marked with fresh damage from recent fighting, his bolter held at the ready. Around him, other Space Marines have taken up positions, creating a line of armored giants between the civilians and the Tyranid assault. There is something about his presence, about the absolute confidence in his voice, that cuts through the panic. People stop running. The crowd begins to settle, though the fear remains palpable. You find yourself able to breathe again, able to move, and you work your way toward the center of the chamber where the Space Marines are organizing the defense. The battle continues for hours. The Tyranids attack in waves, each one larger than the last, each one testing different approaches and tactics. The Space Marines and PDF hold them back through superior firepower and tactical positioning, but casualties mount on both sides. You see PDF soldiers dragged into the mass of Tyranids, see Space Marines forced to fall back as their ammunition runs low, and still the Tyranids come, an endless tide of chitin and claws, driven by a hunger that knows no satiation, guided by an intelligence that spans light years. The consumption. By the 18th day, most of the hive has fallen. The lower levels are completely overrun, transformed into grotesque feeding zones where Ripper swarms methodically consume everything organic. The mid-levels are contested territory, where desperate last stands are fought by PDF remnants and Space Marine squads. And the upper levels, including most of the spires, have become Tyranid nesting grounds, where larger organisms have established themselves. The evacuation zone has been relocated twice, each time retreating to a more defensible position as the previous location became untenable. The number of civilians has decreased dramatically, both from Tyranid attacks and from the simple fact that supply shipments from orbit have been intermittent at best. Without food and water, thousands have simply died, their bodies adding to the biomass that the Tyranids harvest. You have survived this long through a combination of luck and the pragmatic ruthlessness that emerges when survival is all that matters. You no longer feel guilt or remorse. You no longer question the morality of taking food from those too weak to defend it, or pushing past the injured to reach safety first. You have become what the situation demands, a survivor stripped of everything except the animal will to continue existing. The Space Marines have been reduced in number as well. Sergeant Marius and his squad are gone, their last reported position in a section of the hive that has since gone dark. Other squads continue to fight, but their numbers dwindle with each engagement. Even the Adeptus Astartes, for all their genetic enhancement and superior equipment, have limits. From your position in the current evacuation zone, a fortified section of the upper mid-hive, you can see through reinforced windows to the hive structure beyond. What you see is a vision of hell that will haunt you for the rest of your life. The capillary towers have grown massive, some of them reaching heights of hundreds of meters, stretching up through the hive structure like grotesque needles. They are living things, pulsing with organic fluids, their surfaces covered in sensory organs that track movement and heat. From their tops, you can see tendrils extending upward, reaching for the hive's outer shell and beyond. At the base of each tower is a reclamation pool, and these have grown to incredible size. The largest ones fill entire districts, lakes of caustic fluid that bubble and steam, that glow with a sickly bioluminescence in the perpetual twilight of the hive's interior. And the rippers. Emperor preserve you, the rippers are everywhere. They flow through the hive like a living tide, consuming everything in their path. You watch them devour entire hab blocks, the structures themselves partially organic from centuries of biological buildup, all of it fuel for the insatiable hunger. The process is methodical, almost mechanical in its efficiency. The rippers consume, they gorge themselves until they can barely move, and then they crawl to the reclamation pools and throw themselves in. The pools break down everything, ripper and prey alike, reducing complex biological structures to their component nutrients. And the capillary towers pump this nutrient soup upward, feeding it to the hive ships that orbit the planet. You watch as a group of humans, perhaps refugees who were trying to flee through an area already claimed by the Tyranids, stumbles into a ripper swarm. The creatures flow over them like water, covering their bodies completely in seconds. The screaming lasts only moments before it is cut off, and when the rippers move on, there is nothing left but bones, stripped of every molecule of organic tissue. The horror of it is not just the death, which the selection process is brutal. Space Marines and senior PDF officers go through the refugee population, choosing individuals based on criteria that are never explained. You watch as families are torn apart, as children are taken from parents who plead and scream and beg. Nothing. You have no skills that matter, no connections, no value.